Hey guys, so I'm back in the video here because there's a bit of a change in the course now. We have finished, basically, the main content of this Blender course, the human head is done.
Yeah.
But when this course was born, it was born over on Kickstarter, and we made some additional promises. Now, we didn't say they would all be in this course, but we did say we would cover deformation and destruction and VFX. So this section's all about deformation and destruction, and we're giving it to you, all of you guys, for free. So Mikey, what's the section going to involve?
Well, it's a bit informed with the title, we're going to start blowing some stuff up, seeing how we can actually destroy meshes, breaking them apart. That's great for things eroding like a sand statue, or even literally just blowing something apart. We'll be playing with force fields too, so we'll get objects attracting and bouncing off of one another. And also, when it comes to deformation, now that's bending stuff, obviously, and things impacting and denting and crumpling. Great, exciting things to do. Bit computationally heavy, but we'll get there.
Absolutely. So that brings a whole new dimension to your Blender, because up to now things have been a little bit either static or animated by hand by you. Now you're letting the physics engine take over and come up with some really interesting effects. So
let's crack on with the course. I'll see you in there.
Hey, so welcome to this section on destruction. So we're going to be focusing purely on destruction. So there's lots of extra things that you could probably include as we're going along to make it prettier or whatever you want to do with it. We're going to take a look at destroying meshes in a couple of ways. First, by fracturing the mesh itself, and of course, physical destruction. Now, this is great for hard objects that snap or crumble, etc., etc. So let's go have a look at what can be accomplished. Boom! Tank bursting through the wall. Now, I have not gone about and placed those individual bricks itself. The tank going through the wall has actually done that for us, and a bit of extra oomph from what's called a force field, which we'll learn about shortly. But what does this look like in action? Well, it looks like this, and as we can see, the wall blows apart and the tank busts through. Now, this animation is not going to win any particular awards, but it is a great basis on how to get started. So welcome to the section. Let's go ahead and start destroying things over in Blender. Welcome to Quick Explode. Well, what is Quick Explode? Well, this may be all you need if you want something quick and explosive, of course. And now, it can be used also as a starting point, especially if the type of explosion it gives you is what you want. Now, we'll explore what it is actually doing for us in the background as well. So, without any further ado, let's hop straight on over and explore the Quick Explode in Blender. Okay, so I've opened up a brand new Blender file here, and one of the first things I'm going to do is I'm going to create another window, and I'm going to change it to a timeline. The reason for this is it's going to give us control over the start and end frames and some playback buttons as well. Now, it's kind of like an animation, but usually physics is involved, and physics has to go from frame to work out what is going on. And later on, you'll see that this can be incredibly computationally heavy if you decide to do too many things at once. So you do have to be careful when it comes to doing anything with the Blender physics engine. Just like you have to be careful if you subdivide too many times. It just really taxes the computer, and it will look like you've locked Blender up, but in fact, it's just busy thinking about stuff. Anyway, so first of all, let's go ahead and use the Quick Explode function. Now, you can get to the Quick Explode function through a couple of ways. My favourite is by hitting space and typing in Quick Explode. As you can see, I've been practicing. So if I go ahead and type in Quick, you can see that we also get Quick Smoke, Quick Fur, and Quick Fluid as well. Now, we're just going to pick Quick Explode. Now, what's happened? Well, I can see over in the outliner that a spanner has appeared, or a wrench, which means that some modifiers have been applied. We can see that a particle system and an explode modifier have been added to our scene. Okay, that's a good start. Now let's just go along to the particle system. Okay, it's got 100. I don't know whether that's going to make a difference. Probably not. Physics, and no physics is enabled at the moment. We'll get onto physics in another lecture though. So looking at these modifiers, we can see that it's going to cut the edges for a nicer shrapnel. Okay, so this can give us an idea of what it's going to do, and it looks like it's cut an edge along here. I don't know how many pieces it's going to explode into. Let's go ahead and press play. Okay, and it seems to break into 2 pieces. And also, after 50 frames, we can see that there's really nothing else to do. So I'm going to change my end point to 50 frames. Now, looking at the time frame itself here, the timeline, we've got this red bar moving along here, and that is cached information. So when we go and change something, what Blender does is as you play it through, it caches those changes. It caches the movement of what's happening when the thing explodes. It happens in a similar way as well if you use the physics engine, which we'll see later on. Now, what is happening is it's remembering, so it doesn't have to do the calculations again and again and again as it plays through. Now, as we can see up in the top here, we've got frames per second at 24, which is great because I believe that's what the whole scene is set to. So we've got it just breaking into 2 pieces. Now, that's not very exciting. Now, we really want it to break into lots and lots of pieces. And of course, that lines us up now for a challenge. I would like you to go ahead and make some smaller pieces, please. So use whatever method you like to make the cube explode into smaller pieces. Pretty straightforward. Give it some thoughts. Pause the video now and give that a go. Okay guys, welcome back. Let's hop back over into Blender and make it explode into smaller pieces. Okay, welcome back. So we've got our cube here just really splitting into 2 and not doing anything exciting. So I'm going to stop that animation because it's a wee bit dull, and I'm going to go back to frame 1. Well, we see frame 1, it's already broken apart. Let's go back to frame 0. So if we want it to go into many pieces, it would be logical if we had many pieces for it to go into. Okay, so let's go ahead and go into edit mode. And I'm literally going to enable the tool shelf, go to the specials menu, hit subdivide, specials with the W key, and I'm going to hit subdivide, and I'm just going to increase the number of cuts. So I'm going to go all the way up to 10, which it will allow, and of course you can go in and type a much higher number if you wanted. And I'm just going to leave it at 20. Now hopefully that's not too many. We can have a look up here. It's generated 5,000 triangles. That's fine. If you start getting it up into millions, you're probably going to slow the computer down massively. Okay, so now we've done that. Let's hop out into object mode and let's go ahead and play back and see what happens. Aha. Now that looks a lot better. The pieces seem quite big though. That's interesting that the pieces do seem quite big. Let's see if subdividing it any more makes a difference. And let's also see if just using a subsurface division modifier would have done the same thing, because I do like to keep things so that you can edit them much easier. And of course with 20 subdivisions that's not going to be easy to edit. So let's go ahead and explore a different way of doing this now. So I'm going to hit the undo key. In fact, I'm going to hit the undo key so we get rid of the quick explode around there where it's broken it in 2. And let's go ahead and go to the subdivisions surface modifier over in the modifiers tab. Now, where it happens to be in the chain may make a difference here. So I'm just going to up the view count to 4 and let's see if anything happens. Okay, so it literally breaks into what looks like a burger bun in 2. Let's shift this up to the very top. Aha. Excellent. So we can see here that we can go back to the simple as well, so it remains a cube, or we can do the Catmull Clark. And, well, that's doing something. So I think that's a much better way of doing it without cutting things up. Now, we can see here that as we increase the subdivisions, the frames per second has dropped right down to 10. You see that because we've added a lot more information, but there does seem to be a finite amount that the explode will cut these up into pieces. So if we go back to no subdivisions, it pretty much cuts it in 2. If we go to 1 subdivision, I can't count all those pieces, and I also don't want to, but it's less pieces than if we go to 2. If we go to 3, we seem to get even more pieces, but after that, it doesn't seem to get any more finer. It doesn't get into sort of dust or very small debris. So it's worthwhile knowing that we'd have to play even more of the settings to get that sort of effect going on. Okay, brilliant. We've just done a quick explode. It's useful for certain things. Obviously, there's a lot more to be done with this, and we can explore that later on. Until then, I will see you guys over in the next lecture. Welcome to the introduction to Blender Physics. So why use physics? Well, it simulates the real world. We live in a physical world where things fall over, they bounce off of one another, and we can use the physics engine in Blender to simulate this. Now, you can manually place every bit of destroyed or deformed geometry if you wanted to, and that's what this section is focused on, is the destruction and deformation of geometry. However, you can also use the physics engine to animate with. So instead of animating a ball rolling down a surface or bouncing off of something, you could use the physics engine to do that for you. Now, it does enable you to create complex scenes easily and quickly. So you can go down the route of manually placing things and having that exact control, but if you were trying to simulate a wall falling over or perhaps some glass shattering, you probably don't want to do that manually because it would be an absolute pain to do so. But if you fancy a challenge, you can go off and do that. I'm not going to, because this is great for realism. As I've mentioned, shattering glass, falling towers, you could even make some dominoes or something along those lines with it. Of course, those things are quite complex, so we're going to start with something simple. And we're going to focus initially on rigid body physics. What's rigid body physics? Well, as the name suggests, it simulates the physics of rigid or solid bodies. So if you imagine just hard surfaces, so chairs, tables, glasses, etc., they all come under that solid body. Now, if this works very closely with the animation system, as I've been alluding to, you can simulate a ball rolling down a hill or 2 objects bouncing off of one another, and it works in conjunction with the animation system rather seamlessly. Some of the other physics simulations don't work so well with the animation system. Now, it will move and rotate objects. That's important, so it was going to translate them and rotate them as they fall through the air or as they break apart. Now, what it won't do is deform them. Okay, so now we've got that under our belts, let's go play with rigid body physics and hop on over into Blender. Okay, so we're over in Blender and I'm going to do a couple of things. I'm going to just save a default layout. I'm going to keep it almost like the default layout when you first open Blender. However, I'm going to set the end frame at 50 for the moment. I've got a feeling I'm going to set this up several times, so I'm literally going to save the startup file as it is there. Perfect. So I'm going to open up the tool shelf here and select my cube. Now, there are a couple of ways of adding a rigid body physics to any mesh object in Blender. So there is a physics tab. It's quite hard to read when it's all squished up, but it's just there. And once something's selected, we have 2 options to add active and add passive. Now, you can also do that on the properties window itself. There's a little bouncy ball icon. And we've got rigid body. And when you click that there, by default, you will get an active object. Now, what does that do? Well, let's go ahead and press play now, or use the shortcut Alt and A, and we can see that it falls away. And 50 frames seems to be a good loop point because it's disappeared from the screen. Now, if this was active, it means that it is being controlled by the physics engine. If it's passive, it means it's not, but will still interact with other rigid bodies. So if we set this now to passive, we can see it just sits there. However, if we put another cube into the scene, well, let's do that. Let's duplicate this cube, and I'm just going to move it up on the Z-axis there, and then move it across just a little on the X, and make that one active. Okay, let's see what happens. there we go, it falls off into oblivion. So that's quite useful, and in fact here I'm just going to set that a little longer since now it's falling for longer. There we go. So with 75 frames there, we seem to get quite a full animation. We can see it disappearing. So what are the other options? Because in general, it's great to just hit add active or add passive, but in general, we're going to want to have a bit more detail. So over in the properties panel itself, we've got some options. Now, active and passive are here. Animated is very useful because it enables us to use the animation system, i.e. key the movements in, and then let Blender physics take over later on. We won't do that at the moment, but we can do that later on. The mass. Now the mass itself is pretty self-explanatory. It's the weight of that object. Now this is in kilograms, and that is a, what's that? That's a 2 by 2 meter cube, essentially, weighing 1 kilogram. So it's going to act like a 1 kilogram 2 meter cube. However, if that weighed 10 kilos, it would act slightly differently. As you can see, it's not sort of bouncing off as far as it would do before. And if we set that as a very light one, we can see it behaves differently as well. So we can change the mass of our objects. Now, one thing to bear in mind is if you haven't set the scale correctly, so let's bring out the properties window here. So we've got a scale here of 111 and on here of 111, which is absolutely fine. However, if we scale something up, and off it flies there, if we scale something up like that, we see that it's going to act slightly differently. In fact, in this case, because we scaled it and moved it whilst the physics engine was running, it's not like that at all. So let's just put it slightly above. So this is going to act differently because it's bigger, but it will still act as if it was a smaller cube. So what we'd need to do in this case is make sure we apply with Control and A, or go into Object and apply the actual scale. And then it should behave like an appropriately sized cube that weighs 10 kilos. That can be very odd to get your head round at first, but it does mean that the physics will act more realistically. Of course, if the desired result you want is a little bit unrealistic, then you can do that too. That's absolutely fine. Now, rigid body collisions, the next area down, we've got a convex hull and the mesh itself. In general, I wouldn't bother picking any of the others for the moment because it does change how things behave. So if I selected sphere, this will act more like a ball, and as you can see, let's zoom in here so we can see it, it's actually intersecting, and that's because instead of using the outside faces of our mesh as basically where it's bumping into, it's put a sphere inside our model. Now, there may be reasons why you want that, so I don't know, to make a cube roll, but if we were doing that, we could go down to the next area and go to collision margin, put that on, and then increase it. Now, if we set that to 1, let's see what happens. It will, well, it hasn't seemed to do much in this case. I'm guessing it's still going inside the model. Let's set it back to convex hull and let the simulation run. And we can see there's a 1 Blender unit gap. It's literally hitting it a Blender unit away. So this can be useful. I would not set it to 0, but if you're having objects passing through one another, the small that it was at before, the 0.04, is usually more than enough to prevent it passing through. Now, friction is, as we can gather, is how frictionless the surface of that is. So if it was set down to 0, it would have no friction and freely scoot across a lot of surfaces. And if it was 1, it would really grip onto any surface it comes into contact with. Bounciness, of course, is how bouncy an object is. And then we might not see it in this particular simulation. Perhaps a ball bouncing on the ground would be a better example of something that's bouncy, or indeed something that's got a 0 friction and high bounciness. There we go. We can see that was skipping over the surface really quickly and bouncing away. Brilliant. Okay, so there's rigid body dynamics down here at the moment. We won't go into that just at the moment, but you can literally deactivate something until something else comes into contact with it if you wanted to. And, well, since we're here, let's do it anyway. Dampening, well, we can dampen its movement, or its rotation. So we can say here that it's resistant to rotation. Then when it hits, oh, that is just really odd. Was that what we intended? Well, maybe not. Let's turn it down a little. So if something's rotating a little too quickly after it's hit, we can dampen that rotation. And translation is exactly the same. At 1, you can see that, well, it's kind of like it's falling through goo rather than falling free. It's literally not getting through. But if we lower that, we can make the whole thing just a little bit more controlled rather than bouncing all over the place. So you can play with these to your heart's content, of course, to get an effect or a simulation that you desire. And of course, that leads us up to a challenge. I would like you to go ahead and create a short physics simulation. So create a simple scene using basic meshes. Generate a physics simulation with some interaction, so things are hitting one another, and use both passive and active rigid bodies. Pause the video now and give that a go. Okay guys, welcome back. Let's go create a short physics simulation. Okay, so I've started off in a default scene here, and I'm going to delete a cube. I don't want a cube, I want a plane. I'm going to scale up the plane, not pushing it through itself, to about that, and I'm going to tilt it so it's slightly downhill. So I'm going to rotate on the X direction, and then just do that. So whatever lands on here should then slide down. So let's go ahead and add something to land on it. So I'm going to add in a UV sphere. I'm going to use it as a ball. I'm going to pop it in here and just see what happens. Now, of course, we've not applied any physics yet. So what do we need? We need on here, this is going to stay still. So we need to add a rigid body to both of these. And of course, if we decide to play at the moment, they both fall away. So what we'll need to do is make the ground itself passive. And then the ball should hit the ground and roll. Excellent. Now it looks like in this case we're going to need slightly more frames. So I'm going to go up to 200 here. That should give us plenty to see what happens. It should accelerate down here. Perfect. Okay, so now that we've done that, let's play with some of the settings and see what happens. So both of these have a friction of 0.5, which is its resistance to moving, and a bounciness of 0. So what happens if we set the ground with a bounciness of 1? Extremes are a great way of testing things. Doesn't do anything. Okay, so what happens if we set both of them to a bounciness of 1? I'm guessing it's going to bounce. Excellent. So there we go. There's a bouncing ball going down the hill. Let's set this to 0, and I'm guessing it won't bounce. Okay, so this is a great example of experimentation and working out that the bounciness, if one or more of the items have anything with 0 in them, especially the floor, if you've got more than one item, then it's not going to really work. However, what this could, I suppose, do for us is if we go back to the beginning of the animation, and let's say, let's go from a top view here, and let's duplicate this a couple of times. Oh, if I hit the right key. So there we go. So we've got plenty there. And now if they impact one another, because of course, they won't impact each other down a straight slope like that. They'll just race one another into oblivion. But what we can do here is, well, let's subdivide our plane and give it some substance, really. I'm going to go for a simple subdivision. And I'm going to apply that subdivision. Oh, can't do it in edit mode. There we go. So now we've got something to play with. I can pull up some geometry for them to bounce off of. Of course, they won't bounce off of it until we're actually in object mode. Okay, so we're letting them roll down, and we can see that things are falling through the floor. Let's just let it settle. Let's redo the animation. Oh, well, I wasn't expecting that. I'm going to add a modifier and add a subdivision surface here just to smooth those out ever so slightly. Let's see if that's made any difference. Okay, so these balls are now passing through the surface of our model. Now that would suggest that it's not having time to calculate the impact that these balls are having, or literally they're passing through the surface. I'll make sure that let's say the mesh itself rather than a convex hull. Let's see if that makes a difference. So let's reset and play. Yes, it does make a difference. Now, will these balls collide with one another? Kind of, but they're not bouncing off of one another. So let's give the ground a bit of bounciness. Then the balls will maybe be a bit more interesting. And again, this is one of these things that you can play with to your heart's content until you get it how you want it to be. Now, the margin here might help. In fact, it probably does now that these aren't falling through. That's one of the differences here. The convex hull, the collision margin, if it's not there, allows them to fall through. So that's an example of that actually working in action. So we can leave it as convex hull here, and we can see they're hitting one another, and they have got a bounciness of 1. Let's make them frictionless, or make this one frictionless and see what happens. So that's just sliding and pushing the other one down. So because it's got no friction, it's not rotating. So we can add in a tiny bit of friction. Of course, that ruins our physics model. So we've got to start from the beginning again. And now it's got some friction. It should grip, there we go, and rotate. And I don't think I've got enough things for it to bump into. But by now you should have got the gist of your marble run or whatever you guys have created. And do remember to share your work in the discussions over on the forum. Love to see what you guys have come up with, some simple physics in Blender. And as always, I will see you guys in the next lecture. Welcome to Copying Physics Properties. So where is the physics data actually stored? Well, we'll see in a few moments that physics properties are not linked to the object or data block as you might think they are, like the materials are when you set those up. Now, they are part of the scene data block, and this means that, unfortunately, when you append an object that you've set physics up, well, the actual data itself is not going to come across for the physics setup. You'd actually have to append the scene itself into a new Blender file, because that's where all the properties are stored. Now, you cannot make links to the physics either. So when you're used to using Control and L to steal the material data from another area, there's no option for physics. Perhaps that will change in the future. That would be very useful, but it's not possible at the moment, simply because it's stored in the scene data block again. It's not stored as part of the object or the object data block. You can, however, still copy from an active mesh object. And we'll go explore that now and hop on over into Blender. Okay, so we're over in Blender here, and we have just a standard cube as we would do normally. Let's set some physics up on it. So let's go ahead and just add a rigid body like we've done before, and let's go ahead and play that. So one of the ways that you can get data from one object to another is, of course, copying or duplicating the object itself. So let's go ahead and just stop that from playing. Let's go back to frame 0 again, and using Shift and D we can duplicate our cube, and both of them now have physics properties applied to them because it's derived from the original. Now, if we change, let's say we go and use Alt-D and make a linked duplicate, and just to remind you, that means that they are linked. If we scale them in edit mode, they will scale, or both of them will scale because they're actually the same mesh data. Now, they will all have the same applied, but of course, if we set this one having a mass of 5, if we go to this one, it will have a mass of 1, and this one will have a mass of 1 as well. And of course, that in itself, you think would be a little bit problematic, and it is if you don't know how to handle it. So first of all, before we go any further, where is all of this data stored? Well, it's actually in the scene itself. And if we scroll down, so in the properties window, there is the scene tab. It looks like a ball and a cylinder and I suppose it's a lamp next to it as well. I can't quite make all of that out, but we've got a series of options. We've got gravity in here now. That does affect our scene. So if we changed where the gravity was coming from, at the moment it's set to 9.81, which is meters per second in this case. And if we end up just playing it, by default, there we go, the others just disappeared. But by default, after a second, these cubes should have travelled 9.81 meters or 9.81 Blender units as well, because they are linked. Now, these are falling away. That's absolutely fine. If I untick Rigid Body World, well, the physics just stops working because that's where this data is stored. Now, we've got some other options down here, the useful ones down here, and these are some of the trip-ups that you'll come across, the gotchas. We can change the steps per second, we can change the solver iteration. The higher these numbers, the slower your calculations are going to be, but the more accurate they should become. Don't go too high though, otherwise you can also get some very undesirable results where things just go flying off into the ether. I'm going to stop these things falling. Okay, the one that usually gets people is this rigid body cache. Now, if we open that up, we can see it starts at 1 and goes to 250. And it says we've got 50 frames in memory and it's taking up 12 kilobytes. That's fine, that makes sense. If we change any of the settings to do with the physics, let's go over here and make the mass 2, and go back here, we should see that it says outdated. No, it doesn't. Let's just change something else, the friction, and go back here. Perhaps it needs to be running to be outdated. There we go, cache is out. And if I pull this open, it says outdated. There we go. So the cache is outdated. Now, the important thing here is the start frame and the end frame. Now, if you were doing quite a long simulation, at the moment, it would literally stop after 250 frames. It doesn't matter if you've changed this setting down on the timeline to be 300, 400, 500. It doesn't matter. 2000. It will still stop the simulation after 250 frames. And that is something that will catch you out if you're, let's doing a dominoes scene, for instance, where one block is hitting another and they're cascading down. Well, after 250 frames or just over 10 seconds at 24 frames per second, it's just going to stop. And if you wonder why, go and check out this setting here, the rigid body cache. It's literally storing the information. Now, what we don't see with these simple cubes falling, let's go back over here, is it's kind of locked 24 frames per second. If it was a more complicated simulation, we would see it drop down, perhaps even less to 1 frame per second. But once it's run that, it's actually stored those 50 frames in this case into cache, so it doesn't have to recalculate the movements every time. However, everything that you change will actually make the whole cache out of date, and that's the case. Sometimes you'll do something whilst the animation is running and things just explode or fly over the place and you just wonder what's going on. Well, if that does happen, just reset the simulation or let it loop round anyway, especially if it's a short simulation like 50 frames. So now we've got all of these cubes all set up, what we can do is copy the physics from one to another. Now, this is available in the tool shelf under the physics pane. And that's the 5th one down here, and we've got a button that says copy from active. So the easiest way of doing this is, well, there are a couple of ways of doing it, but the easiest I've often found is to move all of your objects that you're working with to a separate layer. That's one way. Or in the outliner, deselect the selection for things you don't want or that you're not working with at the moment. So we've got these 3 cubes. Now if I select everything with the A key, it's only those 3 being selected, and I can also move them to another layer like layer 2. And then when I'm looking at that, I can simply just hit A and it will select everything that's on that layer. Now, I select the one I want to copy the information from first. It will go that lighter orange color on the origin. Now, because they've got physics applied, unfortunately, we can't look at the actual outline because that's just gone green. Now, let's have a look and see the settings. Let's give it a friction of 1, a bounciness of 0.5, and a mass of 10, which we definitely can't see. And let's change it from convex hull to mesh just for this instance. Now we've got all that set up, we can hit the A key twice, and you see that the other origins for these particular cubes are a dark orange. And now if we hit copy from active, it's copied the physics data from this cube to the other 2. And if we can go and click on them, we can see that that is in fact the case. They now all contain the same physics properties. Now this can be a great way of let's say setting up a scene with multiple items. You just all set them up with the same physics properties and then go in to tweak them, or indeed if you've got lots of duplicate objects that are actually the same, that do need the same physical properties, you can apply it across the board. So now, just to practice this, I've got a small challenge for you. I'd like you to go ahead and copy some properties. So go ahead and set up a scene with 5 falling primitives and a slightly sloped ground plane, so it's a bit more interesting when they hit it. Make all of these mesh objects share the same physical data, so they're all going to weigh the same, have the same bounciness, etc. Now remember to make the ground plane passive, otherwise it's going to disappear with all the others and nothing will hit one another, which wouldn't be that exciting. So go ahead, pause the video now and give that a go. Okay guys, welcome back. Let's set up a scene and hop on over into Blender. Okay, welcome back. So we have our 3 cubes here. I'm going to get rid of 2 of them. That's fine. Okay, I'm going to add in a plane and just scale that up massively. So we've got something there. And I'm going to save my file as well and call it 5 falling objects. I cannot see my microphone, so hopefully I can't see through my microphone. 5 falling objects. So just got a capital in the wrong place. Anyway, enough of my keyboard wizardry. Let's just play. Well, let's add our other objects in first. So what else can we have? Let's have a cone. And for excitement, let's actually have the cone rotated X by 180. So it's pointing down. Who knows which way it will actually fall. Let's add in another mesh. Let's add in Suzanne the monkey. She's always useful to have in a scene, keeping an eye on us and our antics. There we go. There's Suzanne. I'm going to shift her over here so she's not getting a cone falling right on top of her. And then, of course, that's 3. So let's go in. Now, I've got the extra things added in. So let's see. Teapot. Oh, that's going to come in pretty large. Let's shrink it down just a little and move it over here. And what else have we got? We've got one more object. What should we have? Choices, choices, choices. Let's go for a cylinder and let's tilt it on its side. So I'm going to rotate it around the y-axis by 90. There we go. So that's a great starting point. And now I'm going to, this one's already got physics properties enabled. So I'm going to select everything from that, go over to the physics tab and copy from active. And then remembering to set this to passive. In fact, I can just hit add passive over here and that should work. It's not rotated yet, so let's rotate it ever so slightly. And let's see what happens when we go ahead and play. Now, we've only got 50 frames, so I'm going to up this now to 200 just to see what happens. It turns out, yes, there we go. The cone does indeed fall over. Now, of course, we could make things a bit more interesting. We could make the floor a little bit more bouncy. And let's go to this cube and make that very bouncy and the friction a little low. There we go. So the cube's bouncing about. Well, that's probably a bit too much bouncing this. That's a new word. Never mind. And let's select these other objects and then copy from active, which would be this first one again. Copy from active. Let's see what happens now. They're a bit bouncier. Excellent. Lots of fun. How did you guys get on? I hope you're getting the hang now of the physics engine. As you can see, it's got quite a bit of potential and quite a bit of confusing settings over here. But rest assured, we'll get to the bottom of most of it and we'll have lots of fun whilst doing it. Please share your 5 falling objects in the discussions on the forum, and I will see you guys in the next lecture. Welcome to the center of mass. So, where is the center of mass and what is it? Well, it is wherever the origin is. Blender uses the origin as the center of mass. Now, that means you have control over this, which isn't always a good thing. If you've inadvertently constructed something away from the from the origin itself, that geometry is going to act very weird when you start applying physics to it. So it can lead to some strange results. Now, they might be desirable depending on the type of thing that you're doing. Now, Blender can calculate for us the center of the mass, and you've probably seen this before when we move the origin to the center of mass. Now, in most object, that's going to pretty much put it in the middle, unless you've got a lopsided object, in which case you'd want to adjust the center of mass so it behaved realistically when it comes to physics. Now, let's go ahead and hop on over into Blender and play with the center of mass. Hey, so welcome over into Blender. Now, at this point, we're going to focus on something very similar to the wall you saw that the tank was breaking through earlier, but we're going to build it up from scratch. So in order to do that, we're going to use arrays. So my first mini challenge for you is to pause the video and go ahead and make a wall. This isn't going to be one of those major challenges, but this is a mini challenge. Challenge yourself to build a wall made of standard size bricks, if you will, or sorry, standard ratio bricks. You don't have to worry too much about the size at the moment. So go ahead, pause the video now and give that a quick go. Okay, now did you give that challenge a go? It's very important to practice your skills. Now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to build up my wall super quick here. I'm literally going to scale in the Y direction my brick by half and scale it in the Z direction by half. I'm going to go to the the properties window for the 3D editor and shift it up by 0.5. So I've got my brick here. Finally, I'm going to apply scale. Now, because we're working with physics, it's good if things are the right size from the beginning. Now, I'm going to shift this across a little over here, and I'm going to add a ground plane in. And whilst I'm at it, and you might not have done this because I didn't ask you to create a ground plane. That's absolutely fine. You can pop one in now as you're following along. I've added a ground plane that I'm going to make sure I start saving my work. I'm going to save it as wall. Because we're going to start applying physics, and physics can crash Blender occasionally. Now, whilst I've actually got this selected, I'm going to go ahead and apply the scale that I've just bumped that floor up to 4. And whilst I'm here, I'm also going to apply a rigid body and make it passive, because the wall needs somewhere to stand. Now, with the array itself, I'm going to use 10 bricks and then build it up from there. So let's go ahead and add an array, and if I'm happy with how it looks, let's go to 10 of them. Okay, let's shift that over here a little so it's more in the middle. Excellent, I'm happy with that, apart from the gap in between. So I'm going to go for 1.1. Bit big, so I'm going to go for 1.05. That looks much better. Okay, so that's my first array. I'm now going to array the array. So relative offset, I'm going to set that to 0 for the moment and set Z to 1. And I'm just going to zoom in here so I can see the relative gaps. Now, because my brick is half as high as it is wide, I should imagine that the relative offset here, if we set it to 0.05 like the other one, we're going to end up with a gap that's half the size, which has happened. So if I go 1.1, we've then got a nice gap between here, let's say for the mortar or anything along those lines. And it's a good idea to keep an idea, or certainly an eye, on these numbers that we've used, because we're going to use them in a bit for the margins for physics. Okay, so now I've done that, I just need to offset in the X direction by, well, 0.1 would be 1 brick because there are 10 bricks. So I want half of 0.1, so it's again 0.05. Okay, so that's the first stage and the second stage of the wall done, and now it should be a matter of just offsetting in the Z direction going up. Now that is too big, so that again that's 1.05. Excellent. In fact, if we go to perspective mode, we can see it from the side, and that looks even, which is nice. Sorry, orthographic mode, go from perspective mode. And we can use a couple and make it super high if we wanted to. That's fine with me. In fact, we could link this together and build a building, but I'm going to leave it as a wall for the moment. Now, looking at that, the ground is far too small, so I'm just going to scale it up a little bit more and apply that scale. Okay, so now we've got this wall on this ground, we've got a basis to work from. Now, if I go ahead and apply physics to this whole wall, you probably guessed the wall's going to move as one object with its center of mass, interestingly enough, all the way over here. So that's not where the center of mass of this wall would be at all. It would be somewhere in the middle of the wall. And if we go ahead and run the physics engine, it just wobbles because it's already sat on the ground. If we were to just, let's say for argument's sake, lift the wall up so it was up here and then dropped it onto the ground, we will see that again, you saw there, it twinged around that center there. So that's wrong. That's just wrong. It's not going to work like that in real life. So we need to separate out all these bricks. Now, it is important at this point to remove the physics from the brick itself. Otherwise, when you try and move the origin, I'm going to stop that from bouncing around. If you try when we go to, if we scroll down here and set the origin to the center of mass, well, it's not going to work because it's all based around here. And of course, at the moment, we've still got all the array modifiers unapplied. Now, remember to turn this off, so I'm going to do that now, and I'm also going to save my work. That is always important if I use the right shortcut keys. There we go. So I've saved my work and I'm ready to do a challenge. I would like you to go ahead and create a physically stable wall. So basically one that doesn't fall over or explode on us. Well, not yet anyway. So all bricks should be individual, so they can be acted upon individually. Now move the center of mass for each brick to the right location. At the moment, it's all focused around that original brick, and that's going to it's going to cause some interesting results, and will certainly throw the bricks around something crazy if you just leave it where it is. You might want to just try where it is currently, just to see the effect, if you want to. Okay, so they should rest on some invisible mortar or gap that matches the existing gap. So when you add the rigid body to the actual bricks themselves, remember to include a margin so that the bricks essentially float on top of one another, but that is to imitate mortar being in between them, so they're slightly separated. Now make all the bricks have the same physical properties, and remember you can do that in one fell swoop rather than doing it individually. If you start playing about with bricks and giving them slightly different properties, that's fine, that could add to the realism of a scene, but it'd be good to have a starting point where they're all identical. There may be some instances where you'd want to change that, but not in this case. So go ahead, pause the video now and give that a go. Okay guys, welcome back. Let's go ahead and create a physically stable wall. Okay, so we left off over here with our wall as individual items. Now I'm going to go ahead straight away and hop into edit mode, and of course we've got all of these bricks. Well, no, actually we can't do that yet. I'm getting ahead of myself, you see, because they aren't individual bricks, they're an array at the moment. Oh, silly me. I'm applying my array in the wrong order, so apply from the bottom up. There we go, and the final array. Okay, so now when we go into edit mode, there we go, we've got all individual bricks. Now, let's go ahead and separate them by loose parts. Because they're not connected anywhere at all, we can just literally separate them apart. Now that we've done that, we can, well, literally apply physics to them. So in order to do that, there are a couple of things that I'm going to do to make my life easier so I can select them all every time. Is I'm going to turn off selection for the camera, and I'm going to turn off selection for these items here, just in case I manage to select them, the lamp as well, and the plane. I don't want to be selecting the floor and changing its properties. Now whenever I select all, I should be selecting, in object mode, I'll be selecting only these mesh objects themselves and nothing else, literally nothing else in the scene, because there's nothing else selectable. Okay, so now we've done that, we've got all of these bricks selected and an active selected brick. So the one that's active is the one that's going to take on the rigid body. And it's actually the furthest one away from here. So if we go ahead and, well, basically play that, we will see once it starts, it falls down and does something weird when it hits the floor. And it does something weird, it gets dragged along because its center of gravity is actually passing beneath the plane itself. So it's actually being pulled in line with it. I think we're going to need some more frames anyway. I'm going to go up to 150. So you can see here, it gets pulled in so it's directly above that and then scoots around the surface. So it's worthwhile knowing that that center of gravity will be funny when we apply it to the rest of this. And let's do that. It's all going to be sucked into this one place here. So I'm going to go to the Physics tab and copy from Active. And when we do that, the whole thing pulls down and it all gets sucked into one place. Yay. That might be a awesome effect if a portal opened up and you wanted it to be pulled into one place. Well, that isn't what I want to happen here. I want them to be individual. So in order to do that, I'm actually, well, kind of stuck here because I've just applied physics to everything and I can't unapply physics to everything without undoing. So I am just going to undo in this case. Another case in point for saving is that you don't want to end up doing a ton of work and then having it ruined. I'm going to stop the playback for the moment and reset it to 0. And now I'm going to remove the rigid body from that. I'm going to select everything again. And then, whilst we're in object mode, I need to go to the tool shelf, and I'm going to set the origin to the center of mass. Now, because they're all now separate objects, and it's got no physics applied, there you go. Everything's now got its own center of mass. Let's add a rigid body to the active one, and then go into the physics tab, copy from the active one to everything else, and of course, hit play. So let's go ahead and hit the right keys. Now, whoa, that's actually dropping from quite a height. We did play with that earlier. So let's set that back down to 0. Does that make a difference? No, of course it doesn't. So let's move everything back down here. Okay, so looking at this, what have we moved? We've just moved this one down. So let's pull. I don't know where it was before, so I'm just going to have to undo till it's in the right place. Okay, so everything there is at the beginning of the scene, and now we're moving the whole block as a whole. That looks like it's now on the surface again. Well, whilst we're in orthographic mode, we can confirm that. Perfect. And let's run the physics simulation. Now, at the moment, the bricks drop on top of one another, which is fine, but we need to leave a gap for mortar. Now, if we remember earlier, we had a margin, so I'm going to enable collision margin, and I'm going to set it to 0.5. I think that was what we had before. And, well, convex hull is not working, so I'm going to try mesh. Okay, mesh isn't working quite as I expect it to either. Now I'm going to just stop the physics simulation here and rewind and just see if that makes a difference. Okay, it is not making a difference, which is surprising. I thought it would have done. I'm going to up the margin now to 1. You know what's happening. Totally forgot to apply from the active, so I need to copy from active. So it's going down at 0.5. Well, let's actually be funny. Let's set it at 0.5, and I'm going to hit copy from active, and boom. The bricks are literally so confined together that they literally explode. Now, that's not the effect we're going for, although it is quite interesting. So let's try 0.05 again, and then copy from active. That's important. Aha, it's not being crazy anymore. Let's go around to the front again and zoom in. Now, is that gap right? It is, and you can see they're kind of jostling and floating on top of one another. Almost as if there was a magnetic field around them. Let's bump that up to 150 again. And this brick is toppling away. Oh, hey, the whole thing falls over eventually. So it's not inherently stable at that point, but we can tweak the physics settings in a bit to improve that. Okay, so after a few minutes of confusion, the wall just kept falling down, and I thought, well, hang on a minute, all my trial runs that I've done, this has not happened. So perhaps, but the other thing I did do is make the wall explode violently, so perhaps something had cached. I had remembered some of the physics of that explosion and was toppling for some reason. Now, I don't understand why it would do that, but it turned that going down to the shape itself and switching it from mesh to convex hull, I thought at first, oh, okay, I just picked the wrong collision shape. But when switching it directly back to mesh again, well, what happened? Well, it was still working. Okay, so this is a case in point that sometimes the physics can get a little bit confused, so switching the collision shape can almost reset the physics engine itself and do some recalculations. And literally, after switching between those two, it started working again. One of the things you can do when this thing is moving is if I grab a brick and move it, well, it really starts throwing things about. Of course, it resets. So after sorting that out, that seems to have fixed everything. The other thing, of course, that we need to sort of figure out at this point, and we can have a look at this brick that's tumbling, is does it look like a brick when it hits the ground? Is it too bouncy? It's not particularly bouncy, but it does slide a little. So let's go ahead and sort that out. So I'm going to go ahead and select everything again. And we need an active brick, and let's use the one that's falling. So select everything after selecting the active one. And let's go ahead and have a look at its physics properties. So it's got a strong friction, and if we set the bounciness to 1, as we've discovered before, it's a combination of both the floor itself, the floor's properties, and this here. We discovered that in the last lecture. So we don't want any bounciness because bricks don't bounce. I'm going to up this number again, the resistance to translation and a little bit of resistance to rotation, and see if that makes the brick just a little more. Yeah, that looks a bit better. And of course, up here, the mass of the brick. Now, these bricks are quite large. They're not to scale. That's certainly the fact. They're a whole meter long, which is huge. That brick is not going to weigh 1 kilogram. It's going to weigh significantly more. So let's say it weighs 10 kilos. And let's see how it tumbles from the wall at this point. Of course, it's going to do more damage as it does, but that feels like that brick now has more substance to it. So, of course, let's actually apply that to all the rest of the bricks as well. And they should now be inherently more stable anyway because they're a bit heavier for their size. If we set, well, let's do it. Let's set the mass to 0.1. So we've got a 100 gram brick, and then copy from active. So the whole wall is like this. It's not going to come to a complete stop when it lands. In fact, if we make it even smaller, you see it doesn't even affect bricks at this point. So let's set that back up to 10. Now, here's a good example. Because those bricks don't weigh anything anymore, they weigh 100 grams, and this weighs 10,000 grams, you can see the effect it's having on the wall. It's actually shifting the entire lot sideways as it falls because it's so much heavier than the rest of the wall. Now, of course, at this point, I'm going to copy from active again to the whole wall. And now I do have to wait for the physics engine to reset, or of course, go back to the beginning. And there we go. There's the one brick tumbling to oblivion because it's got no support. Excellent. So how did you guys get on? Did you manage to create a wall that was stable? Did you have any problems like I came across and have to troubleshoot? Please share your falling walls in the discussions, and I will see you guys in the next lecture. Welcome to Animating with Physics. So, animating physics. Well, one thing to remember is Blender actually allows you to animate almost everything. Now, when you think of animations, you're usually thinking about just moving something. But we can use this feature of Blender to toggle whether we are in control of, i.e. we're running an animation, moving something, let's say, or the physics engine itself is in charge of the mesh. Now, Blender's physics engine is great. It will remember what has just happened in the animation. So if it was traveling at a certain speed, it will continue traveling at a certain speed, but then with physics applied to it. And we're also going to have a quick peek at the graph editor, and that will become apparent why we need to do that as soon as we hop on over into Blender. Okay, so we're over in Blender, and the first thing we need to do here is set the scene. So I'm going to add a plane. So we've got a ground, and I'm going to scale that up by a large number. So, well, actually that's very large. Never mind, that will do. And I'm going to immediately apply a rigid body physics to the ground and make it passive. I'm going to lift the cube out of the ground, he says, having grabbed the wrong thing. There we go. Let's move it on the Z axis, so GZ1, I'll lift it up, and I'm going to duplicate that. So there's the extra cube, and I'm going to move that new one, GY, I don't know, 3. There we go, so they are separate. So we've got 2 cubes here, and I'm going to add a rigid body to both of them. So we're ready to go. Now the thing to bear in mind here is this little checkbox. When we're dealing with an active rigid body, there's a little tick box that tells the Blender basically whether or not it's animated or not. And that's the thing that we can toggle with a keyframe. So first of all, let's set up a keyframe for both of these in the starting location. Now there is a couple of ways of doing this, and I'm going to open up the properties panel, and using the I key to insert a keyframe, I'm going to hover over the area that I want to key in, and we will see a yellow bar appear here. So let's go ahead and do that. So I've got this cube here selected. I'm going to press I, and we can see a little yellow bar, certainly if I move that, has appeared, which means that has remembered exactly where it is. And I'm going to do the same to this cube here. I'm going to hover over its location and press I. Excellent. So that's a great start. We've keyed in the beginning position. Now we need to move one of them by a certain amount. I'm going to move them both to the same place, first of all. So I'm going to go to the side view in orthographic, sides. They're aligned. There we go. I'm going to move them positive X, and I'm going to turn snapping on so I can align them perfectly. I'm going to move it along here and then up to about here, he says, having not locked it in fully. And I'm going to do the same to the other one here. Okay, now I did fiddle about. Fortunately, I've not lost anything, which is good. Really, you should place the frame first, because if you go over the top, in fact, I'm going to do it. If you go over the top of already keyframed, it moves along. So I'm going to set this at 30 frames, and we've got our cube up here. Fortunately, it seems to have remembered that it had been moved, which is good. So we're going to set it at 30, and we can see the number frame we're on both here in the 3D window in the lower left, and also down here as well on the timeline. So I'm going to key in that one, and I'm going to click again and key in the other one. Okay, so now both of them are keyed in. And if we play the animation, we'll see that it moves from one place to the other. No, it doesn't. So why doesn't it? It's just behaving with physics at the moment because we've not said to animate it. So now we've put a tick in the animated box. We should find it moves from one place to another. Oh, it turns out here both the keyframes are in the same position. Okay, so it didn't hold that. Let's move that one and move this one. Okay, excellent. Let's key in that and key in the other one. So hovering over and pressing I. Let's just make sure that is working now. Excellent. So the one thing I want to do here is actually move one to the same place but in a lot shorter time, and then we can compare the two when we switch physics off. So I'm going to go to where it is at 30, but this time actually key in these figures earlier on, say at 15, so it's moved very quickly. So I'm going to go to frame 15. I took a note of one of them there, and this was 5 and 6, I believe, and 6. So this cube here is going to get to the end location a lot quicker than the other one, and I'm going to key that in. Now I need to remove what I've already keyed in. So see, we've actually got a keyframe applied here to that particular cube, which would be a bit disastrous if we wanted the physics engine to take over. But what we can do here is simply delete that particular one. Now, a couple of ways of doing that. I'm going to switch over to the graph editor in a second, because one of the problems, if you look at our cube, I'm going to play the animation here, see it move. Notice that it's dampened at the end. It starts slowing down, and that is because of the graph editor. It's not linearly going between one place and another. It actually starts a little slower, speeds up, and then slows back down again. So I'm going to change this view. Let's actually move this up so we can see more. I'm going to change this view here to the graph editor. So here we go. We've got the cube that we've got selected, and we can see that there's a slight S-curve going through. Now this is actually controlling how it's moving in the X and the Z direction there, and it's got no movement in the Y, which is absolutely fine. That is what's happening. But here we have the actual points themselves, and it's this set over here, the end ones, that we don't want anymore. So I'm going to right click on those. The selection is just like it is normally. I'm going to hit X and delete the keyframes. There we go. That's that sorted. The other thing I want to sort out whilst I'm in this graph editor, I'm not going to play with anything else, but like a Bezier curve, it has handles, and we can change the type of handle. And we can do that by going to key, as in the keyframe itself, and handle type, and you can see the shortcut key, just like that Bezier curve, is V. And if I set it to a vector, it will become straight. It will tend to carry on rather than doing anything else. We can see it's actually changed the motion a little. I'm going to go to the beginning one and also hit V and set it as vector. In fact, in this case, because I want them all to be vectors, I'm going to select everything, hit V and vector. There we go, it's moving along. I'm going to select the other square and do exactly the same. So I'm going to select all and hit V and vector. Then they're just linearly moving between the two places. Okay, so now we've done that, the next thing we need to do is animate this toggle switch here, where it says whether it's animated or not. Because if we turn it off, it behaves with the physics engine, and whilst it's on, it just follows whatever path we've had set for it. So I'm going to go back to the timeline view, because it's a bit less cluttered. And what we need to do here is go to the beginning frame, and where it says animated, I'm going to press I over the top of that, and we can see it's gone yellow. I'm going to select the other cube and press I, so it's animated. And now I just need to work out which cube is which, so I'm just going to play through the animation. So this is the one that reaches there first, and it's the one we've got selected. And so at frame 15, as it reaches there, we can see at frame 15, it literally stops. That's its final resting place. But at that point, we can actually turn off animation. So I'm going to change it so that we've toggled animated off and hit the I key. And what we should find now is when we play the animation, it will remember its velocity and arc away. Excellent. Now this other one is going to a different place, which is fair enough. But, oh, sorry, it's going to the same place, but it's getting there at a different speed. So we should see a difference between these two in terms of how high they go and how far they go when they hit the ground. So let's go ahead, and it's at frame 30, I believe. If I select it, I can see the little yellow blob, frame 30, that's fine. I'm going to untoggle animated and press the I key to key that in. Now I'm going to make the animation itself just a little bit longer, and let's see what happens when we play that. So let's go to Alt and A and let the animation, well, let's start it afresh rather than waiting it to go. So this one's got a lot more initial velocity than this one, so it goes further even though they go to the same point. So it's remembering where it was before. And we can make that even more extreme. We can go back, select this one that's going further, go into the graph editor again, where we've had this before, and I'm going to use border select, like we've done in the 3D editor, and select those three there. And using the G key, I'm literally going to move it back. So this is going to make it move a lot faster, because it's going to get to that, oh, I wasn't planning on it going that fast. There you go, it's flying away. So, wow, okay. So let's maybe move that down to 10, which is still significantly faster than 15. So let's drop it up a little, and there we go. So that just shows you they're going to the same position but at completely different times, and they go a lot further, or can go a lot further there. Brilliant. Okay, so we've learned a little bit there, and if these were to come into contact with any other bodies that have physics applied, they're going to interact with them, which is really, really useful, because that's going to be a good bit of the challenge for you. Okay, I'd like you to go and throw a primitive at the wall that we've created. So animate any primitive you like towards the wall itself, switch the physics engine before impact, and let the physics engine just do the rest and see what happens. Now, do remember to experiment and have fun. I certainly have when I've been trying this out. Don't be put off. If you throw something at the wall, it doesn't go through it, think, why isn't it going through that wall? What would make it go through the wall? What would make it knock the wall over a bit better? Does it need to be heavier? Does it need to be moving faster? These two things are very important. I'm sure you'll figure it out, but now is time to pause the video, have some fun, and give it a go. Okay guys, welcome back. Let's go throw a primitive at the wall. Okay, so we've opened up the wall here that we've been working on, and I need to place something to go and impact it. So I'm going to go over here and add ourselves, lots of choices of primitives. Which one shall I pick? I'm going to pick a cone, see if it can force its way through the wall. Okay, I'm going to rotate it, I think 90 degrees on the x-axis, yep. And I'm going to lift it up ever so slightly so it's off the ground. It's a 5 blender unit, 6. Okay, that should be fine. And I'm just going to literally fire it straight. So I'm just going to flip round from one side to the other. So it's going to impact sort of there on the wall. And so I'm going to move it forward ever so slightly and up ever so slightly. But let's key in its current position first of all. So let's go to frame 0. So let's go to the beginning of the animation, or frame 1 in this case, and key in its current location. Excellent. Let's go ahead and move it, or let's go to frame 10, let's say, and move it forward a couple of blender units and maybe up 1. Excellent. Let's key that in. And let's make sure that is running. I'm going to lessen the keys here, or the frame, sorry, to 50 in total, just so it can loop quickly. There's our wall. Let's play that and just make sure it's moving. It is moving. That's fine. We've still got that brick falling off. Let's give it a rigid body. It's going to flop to the ground, which is fine. We're going to tell it that it's animated. And it should move. Excellent. And we just need to tell it when to forget the animation now. So let's go to the very beginning and say, hey Blender, this is animated, so we've keyed that in. And let's go to the end of that animation and key it, but this time with it toggled off. Okay, here's the moment of truth. Let's fire that at the wall. Oh, what a flop. Okay, so this is relatively straightforward to fix because we just need to move the two closer together until we get the desired result. So I'm going to switch to the graph editor. I'm going to make all of those a vector like we've done before, and I'm just going to deselect everything, and using border select, I'm going to make this bigger so I can select things. I'm going to select those nodes there and literally just shift them all back at once. So let's try that again. I misclicked on it. There we go. Okay, so we've got those. I'm going to go G and just move them back slightly. And I need to lock these to an axis. It's the x-axis here. I'm going to make it 5 frames and play that and see what happens. Okay, so it's going to have to be less. Let's move them. Oh, let's just do 1 frame and see what happens. Oh, I've gone too far back, haven't I? So let's just undo that. GX and go back to frame. That's the right one. Let's see if that works. Okay, so that's not actually working. That's not doing the desired result. So the other thing we can do here is just get it to move a bit further in that time frame itself. So this time, let's go back to the timeline itself. Oh, let's stop it from running. Let's go to that place where we keyed in the movement, which is at frame 10. But instead of it having this position, let's literally just shift it further forward and key in that new position. Now, I wish there would be some sort of active thing to say that you've keyed that in, or it might come up in the console. That is possible in all of this junk up here. But I don't think it is by the looks of it. So, nope, not there. Let's just see if we can run this animation. Aha! And it hits the wall and does almost nothing. How about that? So why is it doing almost nothing? Well, it weighs a kilo and the wall weighs a lot more. So let's make it heavier. Let's make it 50 kilograms and see what happens then. Excellent. So that's bust a hole straight through the wall. Let's make it 5 tons. Let's make it 5,000 kilos. Just see what happens. So there we go. Not that much different, actually. It seems to be busting through the wall before doing anything else. Excellent. So I'm going to leave that at 50. That seems to have a good effect. I'm going to go to the camera view here. Let's make my 3D window just a little bit on the bigger side, so see what's going on. And in fact, in this case, I'm going to move the camera out because it's in completely the wrong place anyway to capture anything cool, and rotate it around, and we've got all of this brickwork flying out. Perfect. That looks brilliant. How did you guys get on? Did you disintegrate your wall in a similar manner to me, or did you come up with something, well, more inventive? Please share your work in the discussions over on the forum, and I will see you guys in the next lecture. Welcome to breaking up a model using particles. So, falling apart. Unfortunately, Blender needs to be told how to break something up. It's not going to do it automatically, which often means we need to create geometry to reflect the part of the model or parts that we want to fall apart or snap or break or dissolve or whatever sort of effect we want from Blender. Now, there are a couple of ways of doing that. Now, manually. Now, this is often the most time-consuming and is not advised. We've constructed the wall manually. That's one way of building up something in order to bash it apart. Obviously, if that was a whole building, that would be quite time-consuming to model each individual brick. Not only that, but it would take a lot of computational time as well. That's a simple model, the actual brick wall that we've got so far. But if it was more complicated, it would just not be advisable to go down that route. Now, it may actually give you the most accurate model or the most control over your model as well. But there's an argument to say when you don't need to use the physics, well, let's not use it and let's just use the physics on the bits we need to do and perhaps animate the other bits. Otherwise, generally anything to do with falling, taking something apart, breaking it apart, is actually going to use the particle system to help break up a model, and we'll explore that in a few moments. Now, physics can then be applied to the pieces themselves that we've generated, and we're not going to do that in this particular lecture, but we'll do that in a future one very soon, or the particle system itself. And once the particle system starts behaving physically, well, then we can have lots of fun with it. Now, affecting the particles themselves. Now, the way that particles are affected by the physics is controlled in the particle system tab. It is not controlled in the physics itself. In fact, the mesh itself, the one we're going to take apart in a moment, doesn't have to have any physics applied to it at all. Now, other objects that interact with those particles do need physics. So we're going to have a look at the particle settings in more detail, and we're also going to look at the collision physics data as well. So let's hop straight on over and play with particles and exploding things in Blender. Hey, so we're over in Blender here, and let's start playing with this cube. Now, if we're destroying anything, we want it to break into multiple pieces, and like we have done before, let's give this cube some pieces for it to break into. In this case, it's going to be quite regular. I'm literally going to go to a subdivision surface modifier, so we've got here, and we're going to increase the number of subdivisions. Now, I'm not going to apply the modifier at the moment. We shouldn't have to do that unless it's absolutely necessary, because I'm just going to use a particle effect to move things out. Now, if in the future you wanted to make this particular, or the bits that blow out, individual objects, now that's where you'd actually have to apply so they are separate objects. Okay, so we've got a ball here. Okay, brilliant. Let's add something for particles to collide with, like a plane, and I'm just going to scale that up. Okay, so now that's scaled up, let's add the particles in. So selecting the, well, it's a cube, let's call it ball. So selecting the ball, I'm going to add a particle system to it, and I'm not going to do anything else. I'm just going to press play, so Alt and A, and we can see what happens. So these particles are being generated, and if we have a look at the particle settings themselves, we can see what's going on. There are 1,000 particles being generated between frame 1 and 200, and they've got a life of 50. So we're not going to see any of these die within this particular scene that we've got set up at the moment. But if I set the end value to, let's say, 150, we're going to see that some of these that are falling, here we go, they just die at this point, which is at 50 frames. They just start disappearing. Now, in a moment when we actually attach that and make this sphere explode, what all that will mean is basically it pauses. It no longer has a particle, so that part of the mesh just stops doing anything really. Now, one of the things that you can do to make sure this is optimal is have a look at the number of faces. So we've got our ball selected here. If we have a look at the number of faces it has, we can see it's 385. So the number of pieces we can physically break this ball into is 385 and no more. So we don't need any more on this emissions value than 385. It would just be a waste. The other thing we can do here is increase the lifetime so it actually lasts at least as long as the scene. Now, the other thing that we can do here is have a look at this start value and end value. Now, I'm going to increase the start value to frame 10, so no particles will exist until frame 10. But they will still last to 200. So some of these 385 won't actually exist in this particular scene that we've got set up because it only gets to frame 150. Now, if I set the end of the particle generation down to 10, that means that all of those 385 individual particles are generated instantaneously at frame 10, and I'm going to leave it like that for the moment because that's more of an explosion. Something else would be more of a, I suppose, an evaporation. So we've got a couple of other options down here, but before we start tinkering with those, you may notice that the actual particles themselves are falling through the frame, this plane that we've got set up here. We don't want that to happen. We want them to hit this plane. So let's go ahead and look at the physics. Now, ordinarily, you'd add a rigid body to this for things to collide with. but it's not a rigid body. These are particles. So we need to select collision instead. Now when we select collision, you can see that some of these particles, I'm going to switch back to the sphere so we can see them. Well, all of these particles are bouncing in and around, and they're not really being dampened, they're just continuously bouncing, which is a little bit unrealistic. Usually they would come to a settling point. So going back to the plane itself that we've added the collision to, notice we've not mucked around with any physics to do with the actual particles themselves. We don't have to do that. What we do have to do with, however, is play about with the collision settings. So if we have a closer look, we can see that the whole left-hand side is all devoted to particles. We've got particle permeability, stickiness. We can kill the particles. Now, that just basically means as soon as they strike that surface, they stop and do nothing else. But that can cause other issues as well, but it's a great starting point. Now, we've got dampening and friction. So let's play with each one individually. Permeability, well, the higher that is, the more of these particles that will pass through. And that's a great way of, if something impacts something else, if you want it to basically vaporize and disappear so there's less debris or something along those lines. Stickiness and dampening are very, very similar in what they do. So stickiness is, as you can probably guess, how sticky the surface is. Dampening does dampen the bouncing and the movement of our particular particles. So we can see it's coming to a rest. But when they eventually come to a rest, well, look at that, they're still sliding away. And this is where the friction comes in. So we can increase the friction factor and play with these until we're happy. So we can have a high dampen and a low friction, and then there we go. They come to settle down. Now, we're not actually seeing anything happen at the moment with this sphere, so let's go ahead and do that now. We've set up the particles. Let's actually have the sphere explode and see what happens. So I'm going to go to the modifier tab on this sphere, or the ball that we've got set up, and I'm going to add an explode modifier. And hopefully, okay, so this is too long. I'm going to set it back to 100 frames, the end 100. Okay. That looks pretty good. I like that. It's a bit too bouncy, but we'll leave it as it is for the moment. Plenty of room for improvement. Now look at that. The particles themselves are all rigid and quite uniform. That's not something we want. So we can go back to the particle settings and change things. So let's go to the particle settings. You will also notice, by the way, that this is, these bits are dug into the surface. There's nothing we can do about that at the moment. They'd have to be individual objects to not dig into the surface like this, because it's literally around each of the particles themselves. The faces that were on that ball are now sort of centered around. So let's have a look at the other settings. So we've dealt with emission, so I'm going to turn that, well, not off, but I'm just going to hide it by clicking emission, a little arrow next to it. Velocity, now that's a great one. As you can probably guess, with velocity, it gives us a speed at which this thing's going to explode. So, well, if I set that to 10, that's going to be quite a violent explosion, and they go everywhere. But you can still see that's pretty uniform in its explosion. Now, in this particular case, we can look down and see there's actually a random option here. So if we increase this random, it's going to increase the random velocity and therefore make it a bit more scattered. In this case, it's basing it from the emitter, the normal explosion of a value of 10. We don't want that. It's probably going to end up a bit smaller in this case. There we go. So that looks much, much better already. Now, but the other thing is, these pieces are still kind of stuck upright. They're not bouncing off of the surface as I would expect them to. Now, we can sort that out. I'm going to hide the velocity for the moment. There's lots of other things you can play with here. But essentially, we need to turn on rotation and set it to dynamic. So rotation are affected by collisions and effectors. And effectors just are other things that affect the particles. So I'm going to turn on dynamic, and we can see already every time it lands and they bounce, they tumble. Now this isn't dampened enough at the moment, so I'm going to hop back to the plane, go to the physics, and I'm actually going to turn up the friction. I said dampening, it's sort of movement along the surface isn't dampened enough. So I'm going to increase that, and I'm going to increase the random amount as well, so you get some stopping before others. So let's just see what's happening there. Yes, that's much, much better. So let's go back to the particles, and I'm going to select the ball again. So there's a couple of other things that we can do here. So I'm going to scroll down all the rest. In fact, I'm going to hide them as we go. So rotation, we can play about with the physics settings themselves. I'm going to leave those as default for the moment because I don't think it's going to add anything to this particular setup. Rendering. Now this isn't going to be important at this moment. We've got a material, but the material itself is really going to come from the actual ball that we're exploding and nothing else. So I'm going to hide the render tab. That's absolutely fine. So the next thing we really need to look at is the field weights. Now this is telling Blender how. There's a load of things here we've not seen before. I'm only focusing on the gravity for the moment. The others are from force fields and other effectors. Now the gravity itself, we can change how our particular particles are affected by gravity. How cool is that? So you can actually make a particular explosion last longer by changing its gravitational effect. Obviously this is going to look less realistic if you wanted everything in the scene itself to be affected in the same way. Now if we remember from before, the actual rigid body world settings, we saw it here, but we also had a gravity setting. So if we wanted a value that was 0.1 of what it was before, I'm just going to go down to -1 in this case, we then get a much similar effect as we had before. I'm going to set that back to -9.81. Otherwise, I'll wonder what's going on later on. Okay, so we've learned quite a bit now about particles and how we can have them explode our model, or at least separate individual parts out, and that leads us on to a challenge. Okay, so I would like you to go ahead and shatter a sphere. So set up a scene with at least 3 objects in it, and that is going to be a ground plane, a cube, and an exploding sphere. The sphere's pieces should bounce off of the floor and stick into the cube. And here's just a quick example of what I am going for here. So you can see the actual sphere is exploding. The shards are digging into the top of that cube, and they're just bouncing and dissipating on the floor itself. So go ahead, pause the video, and give that a go. Okay guys, welcome back. Let's go do this challenge and hop on over into Blender. Okay, so I've opened up a brand new Blender file. So we need a cube, check. We need a ground for everything to happen on. Oh, gone too far. Let's go plane. And I'm going to scale that up by a silly amount. Oh, did I just hit minus? Don't know what happened there. Scale 100. There we go. Absolutely fine. Okay, so now we've scaled that up. We've got this. We've got one final thing to add, and I did say sphere, so I'm going to actually go for an icosphere, because that's made out of triangles. Pretty cool. Okay, and it's already got a number of pieces. I'm only going to subdivide that once. So let's go in, add a subdivision surface modifier. Excellent, we've got a good start. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is add, let's have a look at the number of faces, 247. So I'm going to add in a particle system with 247 particles. I'm going to set the start at 10, the end at 10, so it all explodes at once. And I'm going to set the velocity, I'm going to leave it at 1, but add a randomness of 2. Okay, so that's that bit set. I'm not going to play with anything else there, and I'm happy with the gravitational settings. So I'm just going to start it playing, and we can see what happens here. They all explode. Perfect. So the next thing that I will need to do in this case is start with this plane here. I'm going to add a collision to it. Excellent, they're bouncing. Let's go to the plane itself. I'm going to set both of these at 0.5, and I'm also going to increase the randomness here as well, just so that the particles are all affected slightly differently. Now I'm going to have a slightly longer, there we go, otherwise we don't see everything, and they all disappear. Why do they all disappear? Because the particles themselves have a short lifetime. So let's scroll back up, go to the emission settings, and lifetime I'm going to set to at least 100 so they don't disappear on us. So here we go, bounce, bounce, excellent. So I'm going to go to the modifiers tab and make it explode. Hopefully anyway, there we go. Still a bit bouncy. Okay, so we can go back to this plane itself, and with the collisions we can go to the physics tab, and I'm going to turn up the particle dampening so they don't bounce quite as much. I'm going to set it all the way up to 1, so we should get quite a dampened thing, but with the randomness here, a few bits, there we go, will bounce, and that's absolutely fine. The friction level, is that okay? Yep, things aren't sliding at all. Excellent, so I'm happy with how that's working here. So I'm going to, well, what's next to do? They need to collide with this cube itself. So let's go to collisions, and obviously they're bouncing crazily off of there. And I'm literally going to turn up the stickiness. I could kill the particles actually, and then they would stick straight in. But the problem with that is if this cube were to move, well, hey, that's so cool when that happens. Let's select the cube. If we move the cube, they stay in place and they're not affected. Whereas at the moment, as you can see, well, they're killing them off at that point. Let's unkill the particles. With them unkilled, they actually still interact with this particular cube. So we can have the cube brush through this debris if we wanted to. Anyway, so at this point, it may be worthwhile turning up the stickiness and turning up the dampening and the particle friction all to 1. Then they stick in as they land, rather than doing anything else. Perfect. So the final thing I want to do here is give the cube rigid body physics so it falls. But of course, it needs to interact with this plane as well that I've just shifted about. So let's also give that rigid body physics, but of course, make it passive. Okay. So now everything should fall literally into place. But something weird's happening. So these are bouncing off of the ground, but no longer are they sticking to my cube. And now I've had this a couple of times when I practiced, and I reset the physics simulation. Oh, I haven't saved yet. That's always a good thing to do when you're playing with physics. So I literally had a look at this and turned the rigid body off and on again, and that fixed the particular issue I was having. See, that's all I've done there. I've turned rigid body off and on again, and it's stuck. Now, I got really confused because I tried fiddling about with all settings, but if necessary, turn the rigid body settings on and off again. Now, just remember, when you do that, you can lose your rigid body settings. Now, I haven't set anything up specific at this point, but if we had a load of settings in here, that's not going to be necessarily the fastest way of fixing it. I would save my scene itself and reopen it if I was locked into a confusing situation where things aren't being stuck in. But there we go. We've got our debris scattering around, sticking in the top of our cube, and this having real-world physics as well. In fact, at this point, we could start it off just a little, well, let's actually start it a little higher and slightly rotate it so it actually hits the ground at a slight angle. So let's go ahead and play that. There you go, it's rolling around. Perfect. How did you guys get on? I'd love to see your results. Remember to share your work over on the forum, and I will see you guys in the next lecture. Welcome to force fields and particles. So what are they? Well, force fields are not shields. They're not going to protect you against anything, but they are a way of exerting different forces onto our models. And specifically, we're going to have a look at particles in this lecture. They affect particles more so than mesh objects. We'll play with mesh objects in the next lecture. Now, they do not affect themselves or an object if they were part of the physics for that object. And we'll see that in closer detail once we hop on over into Blender. Okay, so now that we're over in Blender, let's go ahead and first of all make sure that when we're using the force field itself, that no other forces in our scene could be playing with it. So first of all, let's go ahead and pop on a particle system. So let's select our cube first, particles, and a new particle system. Now I'm going to set the lifetime to 200 so they do not disappear, and I'm also going to set the end of our scene to 200 too. So let's go ahead, first of all, before we even add a force field, let's go and play our animation. So the first thing we can see here is they are falling, and that's because gravity on the scene is turned on. So in this case, I'm going to turn gravity off. So I'm going to go to the scene menu and scene properties here and go down to gravity and just untick the gravity box. Okay, so now the particles are still moving, so there must be some force acting upon them. Now, what could that force be? Well, I'm not going to get you to guess at this point because it's hidden deep in the particle settings. So let's go ahead and switch back to the particle properties and scroll down. And at some point down here, we get to velocity. So they're having an initial velocity normal to the faces that they're being emitted from of 1. Now I'm going to set that down to 0. Now as the particles come alive and over frame 1 to 200, they just get stuck to the face of our model. So I'm just going to lower that down to 50 so they all appear in the first quarter of our scene, of our little animation that we're playing. Okay, so there are a couple of ways of adding force fields. One is to the object itself. Now this cube is the emitter of those particles. Therefore, if we go and add a force field to it, it does not affect the particles that are being emitted. If we duplicate this cube over here, we can see that, let's just let the whole animation reset. Okay, they're actually pushing each other's particles away because of the force field itself. Now let's have a closer look at the force field settings. So let's scroll down here. So we've got a strength of 1. Oh, let's go back to the top, jumping ahead there. So we've got what type of force field is it? And there are lots to pick from. I'm going to leave it as force for the moment. It's a point force, and with all the settings left as default, it will be as if the force itself is being pumped out in every direction equally. We've got the strength of the force. Now, the force strength can be negative and positive. So at the moment, this cube on the right is pushing away the particles of the cube on the left. However, if we type in -1, it'll actually suck them in. Now, the particles themselves will not actually impact our cube yet because we've not set it to have collision. If we click the collision as well, we should see the particles hit the surface and start bouncing off and deflecting and then being attracted back again. So this could be great for some sort of, I don't know, orbital mechanics where you're trying to get something to follow around. In fact, on this particular cube itself, we can see that they're just falling out of the faces. But on the particle settings themselves, we can scroll down a little, and where we set the velocity to 0, well, we can say in the X and Y direction equally, so it will come out towards us, towards the viewer itself. We can set that, I don't know, at 5 and 5. And let's see what happens when we reset the frame. They're being thrown out this direction. In fact, because it's the same particle system, that was a bit strong. Let's go down to 1 and 1. Or not 5 and 1, just 1 and 1. And reset. And see what happens then. So they're being thrown out. And then they're being sucked in. And they'll probably orbit around this until they actually hit it. Or our animation runs out, as we can see there. So that's now sucking them in towards this. So that's great. We can see that they don't affect each other's particles. However, they do affect other particle systems. Now, there are a couple of things that you can do. Say we didn't want this to happen, but we wanted it to curve away anyway. We can set up our particular emitter and set up the force field separately. And that's the second way of adding a force field to our models. So I'm going to delete that other cube for the moment, and we're going to try and get the same thing going, but with just this individual one. So I've selected it, and I'm going to turn off the force field because it's not doing anything for us. It's not changing the direction of these particles. However, if we go ahead and add a force field, so that's the add menu, just like you would add a new mesh object or a curve, etc. We've got the option to add a force field, and it will be added where the 3D cursor is. And because I haven't moved the 3D cursor, it's going to appear smack bang in the middle of our cube. So let's go ahead and add a force field, the same one again, just a force field, and that attracts. So I'm going to go for -1 on this force, and hopefully, so there's not enough ejection force this time round. So in that case, we're going to have to make it. So we go back to the cube, go back to the particle system, scroll down to where we have the velocity. I think I was actually there anyway. So the velocity here is just being emitted in the, it says X direction there. Let's just check this. Cube, particle system. Oh, X and Y. I was misreading. So let's set it going off in the X and Y direction. Let's set it at, let's try 5 this time. That doesn't seem too strong. Okay, so they're being chucked out quite a ways. But they will eventually come back. As we can see, they're slowing down and starting to group and come back. So 5 was obviously still too strong. I'm going to try 2 and leave it at that for the moment. So we've got these particles being forced out of the system and then being sucked back in, which is pretty cool. There we go. They're coming back again. So that could be, I don't know, something being ejected from our model itself. And in fact, we can do an explode with those as well and have some sort of funky explosion going on. I'm liking what's going on here so far. Now, in order to make sure that this particular cube itself and the force field that's within, sort of like the emission, we need to make sure it kind of stays together. And in which case we can literally, we can see here it's a field, it's got the same symbol as an empty, and we can drag that into a cube and make it the parent of the cube. Then wherever we move the actual cube itself, the simulation, I suppose, is still running from the same point. Brilliant. Oh, you can, of course, move them individually if you select it individually. So I'm just going to undo those couple of moves. Okay, so we're back at this point here. And what happens now if we have more than one of these? Because they are self-affecting and they would affect others. So let's go ahead and duplicate that cube and pop one here, and one here. We should start getting some interesting effects because these are all emitting. However, only one of them is attracting. So you can start to get some really interesting orbits going on, or suctions, or whatever you actually wanted to do. Of course, we all know that these particles themselves can be changed to be objects as well. So that could be a swarm of bees, or whatever you wanted it to be, swarming around that central cube. Okay, so armed with that knowledge, I've got a quick challenge for you. Okay, I would like you to go ahead and dissolve a cube. So, set up a cube that will break into lots of pieces. I do recommend setting it up in a zero gravity environment initially, just to get the hang of what's going on. If you have any gravity whatsoever, things will just be pulled southwards in negative Z direction by default. Of course, if you go ahead and change the gravity to a different direction, it will disappear in a different direction. So use a force field to break the cube up into little pieces, as if it was made out of fragile sand and it was just eroding away. Pause the video now and give that a go. Okay guys, welcome back. Let's go dissolve a cube over in Blender. Okay, so this is where I let off here. This is where we've got some particles being emitted. Now, we can use those particles, obviously, to dissolve cubes. Now, we need the cube itself to be in multiple pieces. And to make sure that I'm not repeating myself, I'm actually going to use the scene I've got set up here, because I think that would be quite interesting, watching it being blown apart and then swirling around the central bit. I'm going to literally make sure all of these cubes have the same mesh data. So all of these are obviously different objects. Do they have all different mesh objects or mesh data? Yes, they have. So I'm literally going to switch them all to just cube. It's a bit of a time-consuming thing, but it's not going to take too long because there's not too many of them. Of course, I could have just selected them all and made a link to them. So there's lots of ways of doing things in Blender. I've chosen to do it a little long-handedly there. Never mind. Okay, so all of these are sharing the same mesh data, which should mean if I go into that mesh data and subdivide, I'm going to press W there. Let's turn my keystrokes on. So I'm going to press W there and subdivide. I'm going to open the tool shelf. And how many cuts are we going to do? Well, bear in mind this is going to be multiplied by 5 times as well. I'm going to go for maybe 250 cuts. Oh, is that going to be too many? No, that's tiny. Oh, how many faces has this produced? 61,000. Yes, that's going to be a bit too many. That's going to slow down my computer something chronic. So let's try 50. Yeah, that's a much better 15,000 faces. Okay, so now I've done that. Every other one should also be 15,000 faces. Excellent. So we've got how many faces in total? 80,000. Okay, and these are all sharing the same setup. So we should have no trouble at all making all the settings the same. So I'm literally going to add the explode modifier to our first mesh here. Excellent. And away it goes. It's orbiting properly. Excellent. And it should be a matter now of adding the explode modifier to these other bits. So modifier explode. Again, I could make links across. Oh, it's starting to slow down now, so perhaps I had a few too many. But anyway, that's a a good start, isn't it? So there we go. Okay, so maybe too many there, but we can see the cubes are all breaking apart, and they're all in separate locations, and they all start to orbit round. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to let this run, this animation itself, for a little bit longer. So I'm going to up this, and I will see you guys back in a few moments once I've let it cached all this out. And I'm going to render it out as well, just to see what it looks like. Of course, I'm going to make sure my details are low. So I'm just going to pause it there, and before I go off and disappear, I'm just going to show you how I'm going to set this up. I'm going to go to the world properties and set the color background to basically black. So there's no ambient light in our scene. And I'm just going to switch here over to rendered mode. So it's going to look like that. Now, we've got this sort of ready color. I'm going to go in and pick something a little lighter, and of course I've got some materials here. You can choose a different color if you wanted. I'm going to go for my terracotta color, mainly because I like that. And then finally, the light in the scene is all coming from a lamp. And at this point, all of these pieces, of course, will self-shadow one another. But if I go ahead here and, well, we've got a sun lamp with a setting of 3. Let's set it a little higher. Okay, that's 5. Let's go for 10. Okay, that's getting some real highlights on it now. Let's zoom in and make sure nothing's real blowing out. Okay, I like that as well. Okay, and the final thing I'm going to do, which will tax my computer, so I may end up leaving it a while to do the run. In fact, I'm probably going to do it on my PC, which is a bit quicker than my laptop. I'm going to increase the number of particles for each one to the number of faces that are on each cube. And if we remember, there were something like 15,000, and that will give me a lot smaller set of particles. And I'm going to run that simulation and hopefully get some sort of ring system going around my central point there. So I'll see you guys back in a few moments whilst I've sorted that out. Okay, so things have changed not too dramatically. I've still got a load of cubes that are dissolving, but I've replaced that middle one with a sphere, and I've kind of got a young Saturn. How about that? Or something else like, I don't know, a planet with square moons that have been broken up. Anyway, so this was super exciting to make, and when I was making it, I was shocked to see the resources it took up. So a word of warning, this particular blend file with all of the cache data for those particles and their movements, because Blender stores that, ballooned at 12 gigabytes. Not to mention that Blender used well over 28 gigabytes worth of RAM when actually rendering this out. Now, suffice to say, if I was trying to run that on my GPU, there was too much data for that to handle. It just crashed out. So this is the sort of thing that if you start getting lots and lots of particles, you're going to suffer RAM issues, VRAM issues, even on modest cards like a Titan X or something crazy like that that's got 12 gigabytes of RAM, costs thousands of pounds. So in this case, a CPU would be the best place to render this on. As you can see, this was lots of fun to make. I hope you guys have made some similarly wacky dissolving of the cubes as you've gone. Remember to share that work over on the forums so we can all see it, and I will see you guys in the next lecture. Welcome to force fields and other objects. So they act slightly differently when force fields are applied to different objects themselves. Now, they are a way of exerting different forces onto our models, just like they have always been with particles. Now, as well as particles, they will affect soft bodies, rigid bodies, and cloth objects as well. So it's worthwhile bearing in mind you can use them with several of the physics models. Now, there is a shift in setup compared with particles, and the reason for that you'll see in a moment. I hope it's going to be buggy, and so you can see why we need to set it up slightly differently. And then we'll have a look at how to make an object completely unaffected by certain forces. Now, this can be important if you want part of your scene to stay put whilst making the other part of it explode dramatically. Perhaps in a real, sort of a realistic physics simulation, the whole lot would get obliterated, but you might not want that to happen for more artistic effects, or more choreographed effects, shall we say. So let's go play with force fields and other objects. In this case, we'll play with rigid bodies over in Blender. Okay, so welcome back into Blender. Now, my default starting scene looks a bit different to how I set it up before. I had a bit of a computer wobbly. I've sorted that out, but unfortunately, I've got my default scene back as this. So there will be some things that I have to redo. Don't worry, that's just me resetting up my computer. And silly me, I didn't back up the actual blend start file, so I was left with the default file. Anyway, so let's start by giving this cube in the physics properties a force field and a rigid body. Now, just like the particles, it won't self-affect. So let's add another one into the scene. So I'm just going to duplicate that and pop it over here. Now, the forces needed to move objects is often a lot higher, especially rigid bodies, than particles. So whereas particles would be streaming everywhere if we pressed play, it's not guaranteed in this case. So just to make sure if we do have any effect at all, I'm going to set the strength of both of those force fields to 100, and then when we press play, oh, we haven't turned off gravity yet, and the reason why we're turning off gravity is simply so we can see the effect of the force fields by themselves. And I'm going to set the end frame to 100 as well. And ta-da! And let's let it reset. No, they're not doing anything. Now, I've had this trouble before. You think they would affect one another but not themselves, but with those settings, they just don't. Now, I've turned force field off, force field on, rigid body off, rigid body on, and occasionally they actually react and start what I'd say behaving themselves as we'd expect them to. But of course, each time you turn these things on and off, you actually lose the settings you had before, so that's not ideal. So this is where the setup change comes, well, it starts to become important. So what we need to do here is, instead of actually attaching it directly to there, is just like we did with the particles, we add a separate force field. So if we go ahead and add a force field here, we can already see it starting to push that cube away, this one on the right. So let's go ahead and just increase that to maybe 10, and we can see it pushing away. And obviously if we set it to -10, it will pull it towards it. Now, once we've started it moving like this, we should see them bump into one another. Oh no, we have not got enough frames. So there's two ways of dealing with that, and I'm just going to increase the force. Now they'll knock into one another and then be pulled back. Did you see that? They started to slow down. And that's because the force itself is not parented to the other cube. So as the other cube moves, the force itself does not. So we can link those two together and parent them if we wanted to. Now, one of the things you may want to do is, let's say, let's duplicate another cube just over here, and they all get pulled in. Now, say we wanted this new cube to not get affected by the physics. Well, simply we could turn the physics off. However, if we still wanted other things to bump into it, we'd still need collision or even perhaps a rigid body. But what we want in this case is it not to be affected by this particular force field. There's a couple of ways of doing that. Number one, we can literally move that to another layer that the force field's not on, and then it will not be affected by that force field, as we can see here. That is one way of doing it. And then when we bring the two together, because they're on separate layers, one will not affect the other. Let's just reset the simulation, and we can see moving things about cause it to go just a little wobbly, but it's unaffected. And that's the easiest way to do it, to put things on layers that affect one another and not on others. Now, if you wanted it, if it was a particle system itself, and we can see this is now emitting particles, you can scroll down there to field weights, and we can change all of the ones that we want to here. So we can set gravity to have more or less effect on these particles, the force, this one over here, to have more or less effect. Of course, what we've got at the moment is it on a different layer, so it won't affect it at all. If we popped it back onto layer 1, we would see these particles are being attracted in. There we go. Once you turn the force up, however, if you make the force 0, then they just get emitted and scattered. Hey, that looks like a comet. How cool is that? Okay, so we're ready now to set you up for a little challenge. Okay, so your challenge is all about mesh objects affecting each other. So use a force field to make 2 or more mesh objects affect one another. Things to try. Well, we've got a wall that's already having a projectile hitting it. How about setting up an explosion which happens when the projectile hits our wall? And perhaps you want some of the bricks not to be forced out by that explosion. That's something to think about. Now, something extra you can do, and I found this quite fun, and I'll show you a clip of it after I've completed my challenge, is getting objects to orbit one another. That's great fun, and perhaps you will find a use for it as well. I certainly found it, as I say, a lot of fun anyway. So go ahead, pause the video, and give that a go. Okay guys, welcome back. Let's go have our wall exploding when the projectile actually hits the wall. Okay, so I've opened up my wall here, and let's just recap on what's happening here. Let's play the animation. It would help if we had a timeline as well, so we can see what's going on. Okay, so what we can do here is step through and say at 20 it's okay. It's impacted there. It's actually in the wall at that point. So I can set myself a force field coming on at frame 22. Okay, so let's go back to frame 0, and I will need the force field. Now, it's very tempting. I've done it in practice, just adding the force field to this object. It won't do anything, as we've already discovered. It will totally ignore everything you've got going. So we've got our projectile. Let's go ahead and move the cursor to selected. So we've popped the cursor there, and I am going to do a bit of tidying up because this is driving me just a little bit bonkers that we've got all of this mess. So, what should we do here? Let's parent, well, certainly let's parent the field to that cone. I'm going to call the cone projectile. Excellent. And let's scroll down, and I will, have we added the force yet? No, we haven't. So let's add a force field force and parent it to the actual projectile. Otherwise, when the projectile moves, our actual force field will not. So that goes in and doesn't seem to do anything. Let's set it at a force of 100. And that also doesn't seem to do anything. So let's set it at 500. You can see it's pushing the wall over as it comes towards. And what I'm hoping is for the bricks to go absolutely flying. So let's do 5,000. There we go. That's pretty impressive. Okay, so now we've got that. So we've got an approximate force. We actually want it to be 0 at the very beginning. So I've set it to 0. I'm going to press I to key it in. And now it's cached some information, so about there actually. So I'm going to set it at frame, when it first starts nudging, I'm going to set again the strength at 0, and by 25 I'm going to suddenly set the strength 26, so yeah, about there. I'm going to set the strength to 5,000, and I'm going to turn up the power to the power of 2, just so it fades away, so it's not constantly pushing things away. Okay, so let's just see how that looks when we play it back. So it should go bing. Oh, you know what I didn't do? I didn't actually key in that last thing. So let's play it through. So it's got all the... If you don't play it through, it starts ruining itself because things aren't cached. So we've got 0 here, 0 here. And at 25, I want it 5,000. And remember to key it this time. There we go. So it starts from the beginning. Boom. Okay. Let's try 50,000. That didn't do. Oh, let's try it on the right place. 50, 1, 2, 3. That didn't have the effect I wanted it to. So let's go back, and so the effect ramps up. Oh, to only 5,000 again. 50,000. Did I not key it in? My cursor must not have been over. I'm pretty sure I did that. Oh, something weird goes on there. Okay, so the power was a bit too high. That works, but I'm going to have it ramp back down again, so it's not a continuous force, just a sudden force, back to 0, almost straight after. Like a real explosion, because poof, you get this shock wave, not a continuous force. Okay, that works. Brilliant. So the final thing here is just to keep some of the wall intact and make it basically on a different layer. And I'm just going to randomly select some bricks, hopefully getting a bit bigger as we get to the bottom. There we go. And perhaps a set over here as well. So that's a rough selection there. I need a couple more in there. Very exciting, me selecting bricks. I do apologize. I'm going to move that lot to layer 2 or 3 in this case, because I've accidentally moved them to 3. So let's turn on layers 1 and 3. And now they shouldn't affect one another. So let's send in our projectile. Boom. But they are affected by just falling over. They're affected by each other. Excellent. So we've got an explosive impact there. Exactly what I wanted to see. Just that as the projectile comes through. Perfect. How did you guys get on? Did you manage to destroy your wall? Did you have the same sort of issues I did with the strength? You had to turn it up and play with it. It can be quite interesting trying to get the right settings. And I'm happy with this. And there was this final thing that I wanted to show you. So I will show you this orbiting collision that I set up. It took quite a while to render because of all the physics involved, but it was great fun setting up. Okay, so I honestly, I can't remember how many little balls there are in this scene, but they've all got their own little force field and they're all attracted to one another. And of course, when a big bunch of them get together, well, they attract more so than anything else. So here you have them orbiting together and eventually forming, I don't know what you call it, a planet perhaps, with all these satellites going around it. If I just speed up this process, you'll see that eventually you get a solid moon of 3 of these little spheres orbiting as well. That was great fun. I enjoyed it anyway. So I'd love to see what you guys have come up with. Remember to share over on the forum, and I will see you guys in the next lecture. Welcome to the Cell Fracture add-on. So this is going to be all about fracturing objects. In fact, the next couple of lectures are also going to be about fracturing objects using this tool. So we're going to go ahead and turn on the Cell Fracture add-on. It's not enabled by default. We'll just turn it on so we can use it. We're going to have an overview of that add-on as well. We're going to look at the various ways of fracturing our model and how to prevent random explosions when you start applying physics. We're going to break apart the model only using the object itself. There are a couple of other options, and we'll deal with the manual fracturing using these other options in following lectures. So let's go start fracturing things and hop on over into Blender. Okay, so I've opened up Blender afresh. We've got our default cube in the scene that we can play with. I'm actually going to lift that up on the Z-axis by 1, and yeah, I'm going to save that because I prefer it if I'm going to start with a cube that it starts on. So I'm going to save my startup file. Now you may also notice that the rest of my settings have changed ever so slightly. I had a bit of a computer hiccup, but I needed to restore everything. So there may be some add-ons that I need to re-enable, etc. But I'm back to basically the standard default layouts here. Now, speaking of add-ons, we need to go to our user preferences and enable the cell fracture. So once you're in the user preferences, go to the add-ons tab along the top. In the search field on the top left there, if we type in cell, we will have the option here, object cell fracture. Put a tick in the little checkbox there, and I recommend you press save user settings so that this particular add-on comes on every time you start Blender. Okay, now how do you access it? Well, there are a couple of ways. It should now be added to the tool shelf. If we scroll down, there's a button that says Cell Fracture with an object selected or objects. You can just hit Cell Fracture and it will come up. Now, I'm not going to do it that way. I am going to hit Escape to get rid of it. I'm going to use the space menu for searching in the 3D editor and type in Cell. And there it is. And that will enable me, because Blender remembers what you searched for last, to come out, change the settings, and literally press space and enter and bring this back up every time. Now, it does pop up kind of in the way. Does it pop up where the 3D cursor is by any chance? Might do. Might come up on the edge. I'm not sure. But either way, there we go. That's up. And oh my word, there are a lot of options here. And what do they all mean? We'll go through them individually, kind of, as we're going through. We'll be a bit jumpy up and down this list, and we'll reveal things as they become more important. First of all, let's have a play, or let's have a look at what options we've got along the top here. We've got a point source. So this tells Blender, where am I fracturing from? What am I using? So we've got the option of own vertices, which are the vertices that are of that object. We've got child vertices. Okay, so if this object has any children, we'll be using the vertices of that or of those children if there are more than one. Next, we have own particles and child particles. As you can probably tell, they're to do with the particle system that it has or any of its children have. And we're not going to use those in this particular discussion on the cell fracture, as we've already played with the particle system. Feel free to play with that yourselves. We also have the grease pencil as well, so we can actually draw and help guide this tool where we want it to fracture. So let's actually start fracturing something. What happens if we go to own verts, because that's the only real option we've got at the moment, and we're going to leave recursive alone. And in general, if you're running a physics simulation, recursive can cause you a lot of problems, especially when it comes to things spontaneously exploding. We don't want that. At mesh data, we may need to tweak this slider here, this value, which if we hover over it says the gaps for fracture. So occasionally you need to make the gaps bigger, and as it says there, to give more stable physics. That's how you really avoid things exploding if you start cutting them up into small amounts. Now, physics and volume, well, that's absolutely fine. It's going to give all the bits that it breaks into a mass of 1. Now, that can be problematic if you've got small pieces that weigh the same amount as larger pieces. It's going to look pretty odd, especially if you've broken up one object, because all of a sudden you've got a small piece that weighs as much as potentially the whole object did to begin with. That's going to look very odd. Now, when you break things up into individual mesh objects, they're all going to have origins, and this makes sure, this setting that's already ticked, recenter, makes sure that the actual origins are all at the center point of all of those objects. And we'll look at making the weight more logical as well in a few moments. The scene, now this is important. This next layer thing threw me the first time I started using cell fracture. It means that when we actually run the operation, which we'll do momentarily, it puts the way that it's broken it up, it puts all of those objects onto another layer. In fact, it puts them on the next layer. So in this case, we're on layer 1, they would appear on layer 2. And finally, show progress. I like having the show progress on because it basically means you can see whether Blender has crashed or not. And this is one of these operations that can either crash or you get a value wrong and it blows everything to pieces, which we don't want. And I don't mean blow it to pieces as in the physics engine, it shatters all over the place. I literally mean I made a mistake earlier whilst recording one of these videos, and it would have taken about 6 hours to actually do the calculations. It hadn't locked up Blender, but it was going to take quite a while to do, and I'd have ended up with something like 2 million polygons in my scene, which is just obscene for a basic cube. Okay, so let's go ahead and just click OK and see what happens. Okay, so let's go to the second layer and let's have a look in the outliner as well. So we've got the cube cell all the way down to 7, but it starts at 0 here, so that means we've got 8 chunks, and we had 8 vertices to begin with. Okay, that kind of makes sense. And now let's just add physics to this without gravity. So I'm just going to save my scene in a second. No gravity. I'm going to apply physics. I'm going to make sure I select everything to do this. I'm going to add an active to them all. I'm just going to save that in my... Am I in my prototypes? Yes, I am. And I'm going to call this... what should I call it? I'm going to call it Cell Fracture Basic Cube, just so I know what's going on. Okay, so let's run this animation, and it doesn't fly apart. That is something that you should check early on. If you've made something too detailed, or perhaps use recursion, you may end up with your model flying apart. Okay, so that's a good start. It's not self-destructing on us. And indeed, if we were to lift it up slightly and add a ground plane, and scale that up and give that a passive, what we should find is if we turn gravity back on and just run that, oh, we didn't move it on frame 1. There we go. It's broken into its various pieces. Brilliant. But that's not a very convincing break unless it was, I was going to say a Rubik's Cube, but a Rubik's Cube has more parts than that. So let's start playing with how many pieces it breaks into. So I'm just going to reset. I'm not going to play anything. One of the things I do recommend is you pause and rewind right back to the beginning if you start altering anything. In fact, in this case, I'm literally just going to hit the undo key several times until we get rid of all of this lot. So we're back to our basic cube. I'm going to redo there, so I'm back to this position. Okay, space and enter will bring up my mesh tools here, my fracture tools. So we've got this source limit here. That controls how many pieces it's going to break into. So if I set that down to 6, or even, let's say, 5. Let's go for 5 pieces. When I click OK here, I'd expect to see, here we go, 0 to 4. Perfect. And of course, when we have a closer look at the object, we can see it's been broken into different shaped pieces. Actually, I quite like that. So you can play with that and get some decent breakages. Now, there are some other options that you can do around here. So let's just undo that back to before. There we go. I'm going to hit space and enter again. Let's have a look at the other options we can do. So we can actually include recursion, and I'll show you what that does now. One of my favorite bits with this is you can set it around the cursor, for instance, and I'm going to turn up recursion to maybe 4 or 5. Don't go nuts with this. If you do, it will take ages to calculate. And here we have the likelihood of recursion, so you can up that a little as well if you want. Now, there is a clamp here, so it does stop at a certain point, because here we go, it prevents it reaching a silly amount, so it won't go back down its chain basically more than 250 times in this case. So let's just click OK, and we can see that it breaks it apart, then it goes into each bit and breaks those apart individually. Now, Blender can take a while to do this, and I would recommend just being careful when you do it. So let's go to layer 2 and see what's happened. Okay, so it's broken a lot around the base and less around the top. Brilliant. So what that means now is that it will smash up into smaller pieces around here. Let's just have a look at the settings I had. Because I had it set to cursor here, closer to the cursor, it means that because the cursor was on the very bottom, or actually it doesn't matter where the cursor was, it was just closer ones to the cursor get broken up into smaller pieces. I could have gone for random, small, big, or far away from the cursor. So I'm going to press escape, never press OK if you've already got a lot of objects in your scene. I'm going to add active to all of these pieces while I've got them selected. I'm just going to turn off gravity and see if it's going to blow itself apart. Okay, it looks like it's not going to. That's great. I'm now going to reset the animation, pull it up, and actually add in that ground plane that we had before, scale that up, hit passive on that so it's got something to impact. I'm going to turn gravity back on, and now we'll see when it hits the ground, it breaks into lots of smaller pieces. How cool is that? I absolutely love playing with this tool. And of course, whilst the animation's playing, let's say we turn gravity off and rewind, we can grab a piece and start knocking it apart, so you can get sort of a feeling of how this is going to work. And if you let it, I've missed it. I'm not sure I can impact from here. That's one of the dangers, by the way, of moving it whilst it's animating. I've accidentally moved this particular subpart of it to another location. So I'm just going to have to undo until it's back into the right place, and hopefully there we go. Unfortunately, you can't wave something about when it's not being animated. So if we just press play here, it looks like in this case recursion has not caused it to blow itself apart. Occasionally it does, so do be careful when you're using it. Okay, now that's got us all set up now, ready for a challenge. And your challenge is exploding bricks. So, in your wall animation, have some of your brickwork break into much smaller pieces, and ideally they should break up when the projectile hits the wall. Pause the video now and give that a go. Okay guys, welcome back. Let's go explode some bricks into some much smaller pieces over in Blender. Okay, so I've gone ahead here and opened up my wall, and let's just make sure it's still behaving as we'd expect it to. Boom, straight through. Okay, so I'm just going to deselect everything here, go back to the very beginning frame and whiz round to the front and do some selecting. Now, you do need to be careful when selecting because we can actually see this object, the projectile, through the wall. What we don't want to accidentally do is end up grabbing that as well and doing whatever we want to do to fracturing this wall to that by accident. So I'm going to hide my projectile for the moment completely from the scene. I'm going to hold down Control as I do that to hide the force field that's attached to it as well. Now, one of the things that I noticed when I whizzed round is one of these bricks is a bit awkwardly placed. I must have moved it when running a physics simulation. So I'm just going to pop it roughly back in the right place, and I'm going to, from here, start selecting my objects. So as the projectile comes in, it's going to knock several of these absolutely flying. Now I'm going to keep it particularly simple. I don't want to get too exaggerated at this point. I want to see proof of concept, if you will. I want to make sure it works before going crazy with it. So the first thing I need to do is fracture those, and I'm just going to do a simple fracture. I'm not going to do any recursive or anything along those lines, so I want to make sure the whole process works. So I'm going to go ahead. I've selected the ones I want to break into multiple bits. I'm just going to click OK, and that should give us absolutely loads of little bits. Just wait for it to go through, and once it's finished doing that, what I'll do is I'll apply all of those, which should now be on layer 2. Perfect. I'm going to select them all, deselect and reselect. That makes sure that anything else that's selected, in fact we have still got something selected on another layer, so let's just make sure there's nothing selected there and just these are selected. Okay, I'm going to click to put the 3D cursor near here. In fact, I'm going to go Shift and S and cursor to selected to put it smack bang in the middle, and I'm going to add an empty. It doesn't matter what type of empty. I'm just going to use a plain axis. I'm going to name that broken bricks, so I have some control. Broken bridges, okay, that's how I feel sometimes. Okay, broken bricks, and finally I'm going to select everything. Broken bricks should now be the active. Yes, it is. Control and P, and we're going to parent all of these broken bricks, and that also means I can select them quickly as well. Now, we're going to be applying physics to these. We might as well borrow the physics we've already got set up. So I'm going to select one of the other bricks and go to the physics selection and just go to... let's see, what have we got here? Copy from active, that's what I want. So now they've got physics applied to them. Let's just run this animation and see what happens. Okay, they blow each other apart. The main reason for that is we've still got bricks inside bricks. So all of these extra bricks that we have are inside the original bricks, causing this problem. So we need to go through and literally delete the ones we don't want anymore. So looking at what we've got here, I'm just going to skip between the two with the 1 and 2 keys, and I think I'm just going to have to manually select move as well. So there we go. Those are those ones gone. I hope I haven't deleted anything else, which should mean now we can rebuild the wall. Excellent. I'm going to unhide that projectile and just see how it's working. This is being lean about it. This is making sure that the actual scene itself is working at each individual stage. Okay, so that is working. It's not got the force field applied to it at the moment, but that's fine. We can add it in by moving them to that other layer, and we can do that straight away. But it is falling apart, so one problem at a time. It's not being affected by the force field. We can do later on, but it falling apart straight away, to be expected, of course, is not that great. So we want it to fall apart on our command. So we need to key that in. So I'm going to select one of these objects and just make sure it works with one of them to begin with. So we want to, in the rigid body, toggle animation on and off, much like we did with the projectile. So I'm going to toggle the animated here. We want it on initially at frame 0. So I'm going to turn it on and press I1 over the animated. I'm going to go to, I think it was frame 22 where it impacts. So I'm going to go to 22 and actually key in the fact that it's turned off. And what we should get there is this bit staying still and then being knocked out at 22. Perfect. That's exactly what I want. Now we need to copy that to everything else. So I'm going to select everything else with the A key. And now we need to make links to the animation data. So Control and L, animation data. And what we should find is that now stays still and then it gets knocked through and crumbles. Perfect. It's not the best looking at the moment. So the final thing here, I say final, there's always another thing to be done afterwards. The penultimate perhaps, I don't know. So we're going to move all of those to layer 1. Now that they're on layer 1, they should also be affected by that force field. So let's rewind, press play. Oh, that's something weird is happening there. I'm just going to save my work and reload. I'm just going to revert. I don't know. There we go. Boom. Excellent. That's it. Well, I couldn't have asked for anything better there. Perhaps a smaller explosion, since if we imagine where the camera's going to be, most of those bricks, are disappearing off. So again, a little bit of refinement at this stage, just to get more or less what you want. There are a couple of bricks that seem to be staying still. Are they staying completely still? Okay, there are a couple of bricks here that seem to have completely given up with being part of our world. Let's just watch this. Boom, it's coming in. So we just need to go into that force field and the animation for the force field, and perhaps not have it here. It goes from 0 to 5,000 back down to 0. 50,000. So let's lower that down to 20,000. Remember to key it in, otherwise it won't work, and just test it. And again, do little things at a time, and that is much better. You get that oomph as it goes apart. Yes, these broken bricks aren't the best looking in the world. I'm going to increase the frame count here to 100 to watch everything collapse, and I'm going to sort out these other bricks in my own time. You get the gist of it. How are you guys getting on with your explosive walls and bits breaking into various pieces? Hope you're having fun with this. I'm having lots of fun. Please do share your work over on the forum. I love seeing what you guys come up with, and I will see you in the next lecture. Welcome to fracturing with a child object. So this again is all about manual destruction, taking control over our model. So this is a great way of adding some dynamic fractures to a model. Fracturing will use the children's geometry as a reference point, and we'll see that in more detail in a few moments. We're going to experiment with different children to see if they give different results. And finally, a good example of this use is the splintering of wood, and I'll show you how to do that too. So let's hop straight on over into Blender. Okay, so we're starting over now with a default cube. I'm going to make it a lot flatter, more like a plank than anything else. So I'm going to go ahead here and scale it on the x-axis, make it quite thin, scale it by 0.1 on the x-axis, and then just scale it up on everything but the x-axis by maybe 4, not 44, 4. That looks good to me. I'm going to turn snapping on to increment so I can just move it to one side and pull that up. I'm going to duplicate that, moving it along the y-axis, so we've got two next to each other that we can look at. And we can see that we've got the cube there. So I'm going to add in, let's just say something right on the edge here, because I want to see what happens right on the edge. I'm going to add in a UV sphere there, and I'm going to add in another UV sphere here. Excellent. I'm going to go to this one here and add in a cube, mesh cube. I'm going to do the same just over here, mesh cube, and I'm going to add a final one in here, but I'm also going to scale that down as well. So we just got a few different options there. I'm going to select everything and just apply the scale to everything because I've been moving things about. In fact, I am just going to add a tiny sphere just here, so scale that down and then just apply the scale there as well. Okay, so we've got some objects there. Now we really need to make them children of these planks behind. So I've selected all of these spheres, and I've gone Control and P, and I'm going to select the object. That's fine. So they're all now children of that plank, and the same here. So Control and P, object. Okay, so we've now got two objects with children. Let's see what happens if we go and use the cell fracture tool. So I'm going to start with the spheres themselves. I'm going to hit the space bar, type in cell, there we go, cell fracture, and now we get the options along the top, and we want to use child vertices. Now, obviously, child particles, which is the fourth option along, would be if these individual objects the children had a particle system applied to them. We're not going to deal with particle systems at the moment, so I'm going to select here child vertices, and I'm just going to up the level here of shards that are created, or the maximum number of shards that can be created, from 100 to 300, just so there's plenty going on here. And I'm just going to click OK. I'm not going to change anything else. And we can see here as it's making it, how it's shattering apart our particular model here. I don't know how long this is going to take. Hopefully 300 isn't too many. Nope, that's done. Perfect. And of course, this has been put onto layer 2. Now, I'm actually going to move this one here and its children. So I'm going to move that to layer 3. I'm going to go to layer 3. And I'm going to now run the cell fracture tool again with exactly the same settings, so we can compare the two. And that was a lot quicker. So let's have a look at what happens with the spheres themselves. Now, the sphere itself has a lot of vertices in it compared to those cubes. So I'm not surprised that we've got more. Let's select everything there. We've got more detail than we would do otherwise. And it is concentrated around here. Now, one of the things that it would be a good idea to check is going and turning gravity off. That's fine. Gravity, there it is. Turn it off. And add a rigid body to all of this. And just make sure it's not flying apart, you know, before we do anything else. Is this just going boom all over the place? Now, one way of just checking to make sure that is working, how we'd expect it to, is to literally grab one of the pieces, press escape when you finish doing it, and we can see that that can shatter into quite a few pieces. Brilliant. I love that. Let's go have a look at how the other one has behaved. So that's on layer 4, so we'll whiz over there. Let's just see what that looks like. Let's select everything. Okay, so that's been broken into far fewer pieces. And, well, let's just run the physics effect on that and just see. Okay. So it's all to do with the number of, the clues in the name, the number of vertices the children has. And that looks pretty awesome. Now, because I've moved that there and placed it in a different position, when it starts, they're actually intersecting one another, so they're forcing each other apart. So I'm just going to pause that, go back. We can see I have moved the piece. I'm just going to undo until it's in the right place. So that is a warning to you guys. Although it's fun to grab things and move them about and knock... Oh, I don't think this has got physics applied to it. You can very easily end up breaking stuff. Ah, this one actually flies apart by itself. Or is that me micro-moving things? So I'm just going to undo a couple of times. There we go. It's to that point then. Just press play. Okay, so that is flying apart. So we would need to work on that. In fact, there's one last thing to just try here. Right, that's before reapply and play. Okay, so that's definitely got some problems there. So we'd need to work on the margins in order to sort that out. I'm not going to play too much in terms of detail to figuring out how to break this one apart sensibly. Of course, we could just enable animation when it comes to something hitting that and it breaking up. Okay, so something like wood is a bit, well, it's a bit more difficult, a bit more complex than that. And I'll show you the rough idea behind what you can do, because we just use primitives at the moment. But we would need something a bit more exciting, a bit more jagged in order to do that. So I'm just going to start up a new Blender file so I don't have to worry about that. I'm going to scale this on the Z-axis by 5, and I'm going to scale it not on the Z-axis by 0.2, so it's very thin. That looks good to me. Almost like a wooden chair leg or something along those lines. Okay, so now we've got that, I'm going to add in a plane, and this is going to be our child object. So I might as well parent them together now. Okay, so this child object here needs to create some jagged edges. How do we do that? Well, there's a couple of ways of doing that. So the easiest that I found so far, I'm going to scale this up at this point and scale the plane back down. Okay, so now we have the plane there. We're actually going to go in to edit mode and subdivide it into lots and lots of little pieces. So I'm going to go up to maybe 20. It's going to seem a bit much at first, but bear with me. If we scroll down when we subdivide, there's this fractal option. And if you go a bit crazy, it does go a bit crazy. So don't go too high. You don't want them crossing over one another, but we want them a bit jagged. Once you've done that, you can then scale that on the Z-axis to make it even more exaggerated. And we can just make that really big, like splinters. I'm just going to scale that in so it's kind of just popping out, so I'm not losing any of the detail there. That is really good. Okay, so we've got this all set up, so we can go straight to this object that we want to splinter, that we want to use the child of, go to cell fracture as we've done before, make sure it's selected on child. Now, because we're actually breaking it apart with lots and lots of pieces, wood tends to splinter lots, I'm going to go to this area here, the source limit, and set that to 500, so it's got plenty of opportunities to splinter. Now, as we go down here, there's something else that you can work on, and that's the scale. Now, this goes from 0 to 1. This is X, Y, and Z. Now, we're only really dealing in the Z direction, and we want to emphasize the actual Z, all that stretchiness, the zigzags that we've got there. We want to make sure there's as splintery and as sharp as possible. So in this case, we'll want to turn this down in order to exaggerate. I'm not quite sure how low I need to go, and this is one of these cases where practice and also just trying out settings. If you're doing this on a big project, you just go off to one side, open up a new file, and just play with the model, append it in to your heart's content. You can muck around with it and not ruin the main model. So I'm just going to click OK here and pray it doesn't crash Blender, because it might take a while to go through and use the child vertices there. There we go. It's starting to go through and sort it out. Now, one of the issues that you may come across excuse me, is the shards being too big and clunky. And again, that's something you just have to work on. You have to adjust settings and just try out different ways of basically breaking apart the model. Now, we may have actually ended up with too many shards here. Note they've come back in. Occasionally, when you do this type of technique with a bit more complex a model, it can go a bit wonky. Okay, I think that's now done. So I'm going to... Ooh, we've got a lot. How many did it break it into in the end? Almost all 500. Wow, lots of things to break into there. So let's go to the second layer. And again, I'm just going to turn off gravity. We can see that this top bit and bottom bit are almost intact compared to the rest of it. Now I'm going to turn off gravity once again, just to make sure that when we knock it into things and play with it, we're actually seeing it work as is. So let's press play, and it doesn't throw itself apart. Brilliant. Okay, let's just play again and see how many pieces we've splintered that into. Oh, quite a few. And if we just pause that there, if that had... Oh, use the right key. That had a wood texture on it. Of course, wood doesn't quite blow apart like that. So we've got some other things to play with. But you get the idea that now it's shattered in the middle around where we had those splinterings happening. And the other thing you can do at this point, of course, is let's just undo all of that. I know, undoing all the hard work. And this is before the splinter happened. Yep. Now I can take this splintering child and, of course, duplicate it, move it up, rotate it round by maybe on the, what do we want? X-axis by 180, so it's the other way up. And it'll still be a child. And using that, it will create a different type of break. Again, we can go in and... using the cell fracture. I'm not going to set it at 500 this time. I'm just going to lower it down as an idea of what can happen. Just click OK. Now, this is covered up, of course, by what's going on here. In fact, a higher level might have been a bit better, a higher source limit, because now we've got two places that are being fractured. And you can end up, obviously you don't have to use a jagged thing like this. You could use a plane slicing through it if you wanted. So let's just go and have a quick look at how that's going to behave. Let's add an active to that. Yeah, we have undone gravity, so let's put gravity off again. And let's play. Okay, it's not coming apart. But you can see there how it's splintered in the middle, but further up on this particular, I'm going to pause it there. Further up, the splintering is, well, it's a bit like wood. It's split apart. Pretty awesome, hey? Excellent. So this is a bit of a zero gravity example, but if you're doing slow-mo, it's almost good to have gravity off, or at least a very low value of gravity, so that pieces aren't falling away quite as quickly in your scene. So that has come out pretty well. I love the splintering effect that's come up here. Now, this particular lecture is not having a challenge because I'd like to go straight in and show you the same tool, but this time using the grease pencil to control it. And then once we've mastered the fracture tool, we'll be very close to the end of section challenge. If you played with this a little further and have come up with something pretty awesome, which I'm sure you guys can do, remember to share with us so we can see your efforts over on the forum. And I will see you guys in the next lecture. Welcome to fracturing with the grease pencil. So this is all about manual destruction, but this time with drawing, which gives us even more control over how the object will fracture. Now this probably is about as manual as you want to get before it starts getting too onerous to do anything. Okay, so in a few moments we're going to show you how to set up the grease pencil to work with the fracture tool, because if you just use it by default, it won't work. There's one setting that we've got to nail, and then we're going to be using the grease pencil for fracture guides. So let's go hop straight on over into Blender. Okay, so before we jump in and start scribbling over our model with the grease pencil, we need to make sure we've got a few things ready. First of all, I want a canvas to be able to draw on, and this cube is not going to be quite right for me. So I'm going to scale it on the z-axis by 0.1, so it's nice and thin. And I'm going to scale it again on without being on the z-axis by, there we go, 8. That's plenty big enough. I'm also going to apply the scale at this point with the right set of keys, Control and A, scale. Perfect. So before we start scribbling on it, we need to open up the 3D Editor Properties panel, go down to where it says Grease Pencil, and we need to change this to Object so that the Grease Pencil and the Fracture tool talk to one another. Right, so let's get rid of the tool shelf, zoom round to the top, and the Properties window there, that's gone as well. Orthographic projection, viewed from the top. Perfect. I'm also going to get rid of the timeline here, that's just not needed. So let's start by just drawing a single line. I'm holding down the D key, grease pencil, just a single line. Let's open up the cell fracture tool, go to grease pencil. I'm not going to change any other settings, and let's see what happens. Okay, so it looks like excellent. So the splintering seems to almost be perpendicular. I'm calling it splintering here. The fracturing seems to be almost perpendicular to that particular line that I drew. Okay, so let's just undo that and see what happens with 3 lines. So I'm going to draw one line on this side and one line on this side. And let's do the same thing again. Space, enter, grease pencil, okay. Okay, excellent. So what we're seeing here is the grease pencil itself isn't drawing where the fractures are going to be. That's quite important. It's drawing a line guiding where the fractures are going to be. So the fractures aren't necessarily following this exact path. Let's go back to where those lines are so we can see them. So we've got a line here, a line here, and a line here. In fact, just so we know what's going on, I'm going to go to the scene settings and redraw these lines, just so we can see them as, well, roughly as they are when we go over to our other object. So over here, so we can see what's going on. Select everything. Oh, there we go. So we can see here that it splits between these lines almost equally. Okay, so what happens if we join this line up perhaps with a spiral or a circle? Let's try that. So at this point, I'm just going to get rid of those points completely. And on the object, I'm going to make sure I'm on the right object here. So we can actually select that and just get rid of it. That's probably going to be the quickest way rather than just deleting it. Going to go back around to the top orthographic. I'm just going to delete the grease pencil I've already done on the object. So making sure it says object, let's draw some concentric circles. So 1, 2, 3. I'm just going to draw an absolute squiggle down the side there and see what happens. You know, this is one of these things where experimentation is going to reward you. Now, because we've got a few other bits to break up here, I'm going to turn that up to maybe 200 so there can be more shards. How about that? We've actually got shattering happening in a circle. Now you may notice that when glass breaks, sometimes it breaks in that type of pattern. Again, if you are trying to emulate something from the real world, I would strongly recommend you're using reference material. Let's go have a look at how that looks. That is awesome. So I could just imagine something has impacted this bang in the middle there. So let's make sure, once again, I'm going to say let's make sure. I'm probably not going to correct it at this point in time, but let's check and see how this behaves when you apply physics to it. So we're just going to apply active body with no gravity whatsoever and basically make sure it doesn't throw itself apart. Because if you're starting from a model that spontaneously explodes on you, and by the way, it's not, I know the timeline's not here, but with Alt and A, we can see it's running through just here. So that is already a great start. Now, of course, we can have a bit of fun with that. We can literally, well, let's add something else to the scene rather than playing about. So in object mode, I'm going to add in what shall I add? A UV sphere, almost like a ball hitting it. I'm going to give that active as well. And then I can literally just lower it in there and smash just comes through. How cool is that? That's awesome. Okay, guys, that's it for the grease pencil. Have lots of fun with it. Remember to share your particular work. What did you come up with when you played with this? Boom. Oh, it's just reset. I love playing with that. Well, okay, I'll stop doing that now. Remember to share your work over on the forums, and I will see you guys. Oh no, it moved too quick. In the next lecture. Welcome to animating render layers. So this is all about swapping out models and taking control over what is appearing in our scene at any one time. Now this is critical when you don't want to see the breaks before an object actually breaks. Very important when it comes to things like glass and ceramics, where you can really see the cracks in a surface. Now we can get away with it on some objects like our brickwork. Now of course this doesn't have to just be used when you're fracturing objects. You can swap models out if you're about to do something that's in need of a different model. So you may already have a model that's happens when something breaks apart. You may have modeled in detail exactly how you want that broken apart. Again, this is referring back to breaks, admittedly, but you could swap out one model for another if you just wanted to make things literally appear and then go pop and change to something else. Now, a glass object would look absolutely awful if you just had the breaks being rendered. So this is one of the main reasons why you'd want to swap out models, is simply because it wouldn't look right. No other difference than that. Now, swapping out the model at the moment of breaking will solve that issue. So this is mainly to do with rendering an animation more than anything else, but it can also be useful when trying out different models as well. You can flick between them. Great if you're showcasing your work as well. So let's go play with this now and hop on over into Blender. Okay, so I'm in a brand new Blender file at this point, and what we need to do is first learn where render layers are and what they are. So your render layers are quite simply the layers that you've got active at any one time, and you can control those as well and have different settings for your render layers. So where are they? Well, if we go over to the properties window and click on the second tab, and if we hover over that, we can see it's called render layers. So let's go over there now. Now you can have several render layers already set up if you want to. We're just going to deal with one at the moment to keep things straightforward. Now, the ones that we're going to be interested in at the moment are the scene layer and the exclude layer. Now, you cannot animate the scene layer. So if we try and go over the top of any of those and press I, it just says layers property cannot be animated. We can see the error in the top up there on the info header. So what can we animate? Well, we can animate the exclude. Now it is important that we realize that the exclude itself, the whole thing is animated, not the individual layers. That confused me something rotten when I first started using Blender. I was like, why can't I? And I was basically turning one thing off and one thing on and getting myself in a complete muddle. So we'll go through animating that and making sure it works. Now, one of the very important things at this point, before we even start playing with the render layers and excluding them, is realizing what is on what layer. So first of all, I'm just going to turn on I'm not sure if I've got it turned on. So I'm going to go to my add-ons and go to layers. No, I haven't got layer management turned on. One of those other ones I forgot. I'm going to save my user settings. So with the layer management on, I can go to the layer tab in the tool shelf and start thinking consciously about what my layers are called. So it's at this point you want to realize that some of your stuff you'll want to make sure is never excluded, like your lighting, for instance, unless you wanted your scene to go completely dark. So with that, we can call layer 1, well, I won't call layer 1 lighting. I think that would be silly since everything starts on layer 1, unless you started playing really a lot with your startup file. So we can call this one, let's say, basic. And what's this layer down here? No, we don't know that. That's layer 11. So we can see the little eyeball when I've clicked down here on the 3D editor header and switched to a different layer. We've got layer 11 turned on. And layer 11's got nothing on it. I'm going to call that lighting. Yep, lighting. And lighting and camera. I'm going to put the two on the same layer. Okay, so now we have lighting and camera set up. We better move the lighting and camera to that layer. So I'm going to go back to layer 1 and move those two objects with the M key. Oh, M, and then this layer down here. And then hopefully they will be on the right layer. Now, just to make sure things are working as we'd expect them to, I'm going to press function. Oh, I'm going to press F12 here. And there we go. It's going to render out. And we can see here we've got light in our scene. That's because if we look over here on the render layers, we've got layer 1 and layer 11 both active. If we had forgotten and only had layer 1 active, then of course when we go ahead and render, there is no lighting apart from the ambient lighting that's in the environment. So it is important you realize whatever ones of these are turned on are going to be included when you actually hit the render, whether that's an animation or whether a still render like this. Now, if you wanted more than one of these active, then you could quite easily hold down the Shift button and click the ones you wanted, or even just click and drag over the top and you'll see them turn on. And if they're in the state of turning them on, they don't turn others off. And if they're in the state of turning things off like they are at the moment, they will turn everything off that you move the mouse over. So now we've got an idea of how we can turn them on and off. The next thing we need to do is work out how to animate that so we can switch things in and out. Whether that be a fractured object, so they don't start fractured, very important if it's something like glass. You could quite easily imagine if it was a glass cube that we were dealing with and we'd fractured, it would look horrible before it was supposed to be broken. So, in order to emulate this properly, what we can do here is, and I'm not going to fracture this particular object this time, I've got my basic object on layer 1. On layer 2, I'm going to go ahead and add myself something completely different, a cone. And I'm also going to move it up one Blender unit as well, so it is occupying the same space. Now, this is on layer 2. We can check that by just isolating layer 2. We can do it down here or in the Render Layers tab. So we can move individually around. Now remember, we will always need this bottom one on, layer 11, otherwise we'll have no light in our scene. So we've got these two things on different layers. Now ordinarily, because you cannot animate the layers themselves, we have to have all of them turned on. Now that they're all turned on, we have to animate when we exclude certain layers. And it's the state of the entire block that is animated. So if we start off with excluding layer 2, and we key that in by pressing I, and then go to layer frame, let's say 25 or thereabouts. That says 29, so I'm really off. I'm just going to use the selector here, 24. There we go. 1 second later, I'm going to key in a new setup. So this time layer 1 is excluded, and that will be everything that is on layer 1. So this is where you have to really be organized about your layers. So now as we go through, we should see that it starts off with layer 2 being excluded, and then layer 1 becomes the excluded one. Okay, so how does that look? Well, let's go ahead and animate between frame 1 and 50. I'm just going to check my settings for rendering. I've recently installed an external graphics card for my Mac, so some of these settings do need changing. I'm just going to save this scene that we're working on here. So I'm just going to call this render layers. I'm just going to save that there. And I'm literally going to render an animation. So I've gone up to the render tab and hit render animation. And we can see it's just going to go through here and render all. It's not going to be particularly exciting. But we should see now as it's rendering, because it's rendering at 1 frame every 1.5 seconds, not particularly stellar. Now we should see, and in fact if it's going this slow I could have condensed the example. But once it reaches, and we're almost there, have a look. Once that reaches frame 24, our cube will spontaneously become a cone. How awesome's that? And you can use this to control your renders very, very accurately. And it's a great way of making sure, let's say, if something started as a solid and then it was breaking up, that you didn't have an issue when it came to actually rendering it in the first place. Because the last thing you want is a piece of glass or something that's breaking apart. Now we could get away with it on the wall, remember, because of the kind of wall texture, and walls tend to have cracks and bumps in them, so that's not a problem. But if it was glass, and we can accentuate that now, we can actually see what would happen. So we've got these two objects here, and I'm not going to make one of them, well, we could actually make one of them the broken square. We can go back and do this. And so the easiest way of doing that would be to go back to the 3D view, fracture this, well, let's go to the second layer first and delete that cube. Go back to the first, the cube layer here, and then let's fracture it. So let's go and cell fracture. And I'm not too fussed of how it ends up fractured. So we've got all the broken layer on layer 2. And let's give these guys a material that is glass. So I'm going to use nodes. I'm going to go to a glass BSDF. And let's just render that out and see what it looks like. So that's what it looks like with, that is the fractured one. Oh, it's with it both turned on. So the way of just checking this, and in fact that would change as we're looking around. Perfect, okay. I'm going to add a floor plane and scale that up. I'm going to give that a new material, and just a diffuse material, that's fine. Of course, we've got the lighting turned off at the moment as well. There we go. So our glass is sitting on a table or whatever, and I'm just going to give the lamp a bit more brightness as well. I'm going to make it a sun lamp to start with, and not a brightness of 100, maybe even a brightness of 2. There we go. So that's not too bright there. And that's what it looks like. And of course, when we break that apart, and let's just swap these layers over. Oh, here we go. I've got my ground on layer 1. You see how easy it is to forget. So let's move the ground to layer 3. Then I can have layer 3 and 1 turned on, or whatever combination I want. I've just got to remember to turn them on. So we see here this one's fractured, and it looks significantly different to this one here. And we can even render that out just to make sure it makes sense. I'm going to actually render that out now, and instead of you guys watching, I'm going to wait until I can actually play it back sensibly. Okay, so what's going on here? The floor's not being shown. Why is this happening? It's because I've actually turned off, and this is a good idea to watch your renders. You can see the problems live here. The scene only has layer 1 turned on, and I want at least these 4 layers turned on. In fact, everything wouldn't be a bad idea, unless I had things hidden, of course. So let's go ahead once more, and this time I'm going to swap them over just so it's nice and quick. I'm going to have a 20 frame animation. I'm going to swap them over at frame 10. Okay, so at frame 10 we're going to key in that exclude, and it should still start. Excellent. So that goes all the way to here. Okay, so initially we want to exclude the broken one, which is on layer 2, which is fine, and then we want to exclude layer 1. Let's key that in. So 2 and then 1. Perfect. So now when we go ahead and I render the animation, everything should be there. Of course, this is taking a lot longer to render now because we've got a glass shader in there rather than a diffuse. So I'm glad I did cut the frames down, even though now it's going to take a bit longer. But we'll see when we play the animation back in a few moments, the difference it makes. Okay, so here we go. We're just finishing off the final frame. It's only 20 frames in total. And I can go to render and play back the rendered animation just to see what it looks like. And we can see there it's flicking between the two quite rapidly because there's less than a second between them. But we get to see the difference now. One, this nice clean one at the very beginning, is how it would look if you were trying to have just a basic glass cube, and then we've got this horrible artifacty one where it's actually broken. So you can see the difference there that it would make if you were rendering an object in such a way, whether it's cracked or, well, mainly if it's cracked. And this is also a great example if you just need to swap something out. So say you're going to transmute between two things instantly, like pop, away you go. Well, you can do that using this technique as well. Now just remember you've only got so many layers to work with, so don't use them sparingly, but use them intelligently as well. And remember, you can always set up scenes. If you were doing a full-blown animation, even if it was just a short, each scene would be seconds long. You would not try and cram everything into one scene. You'd generate a new scene to do that. Okay, brilliant. How are you guys getting on? Can you think of some other uses for this? I'd love to hear your ideas over on the forum, so join us at forum.gamedev.tv, and I'll see you guys in the next lecture.
Hey, so hopefully you had a lot of fun blowing things up with Mikey. I know he had a lot of fun making this section. The purpose of it is a bonus section. It's to deliver to the promises that we made to our Kickstarter backers. All you guys have got it for free. And what's more, it's not the last bonus section in the course. So Mikey, let's recap what they learned and what they can do with what they learned in this section.
Well, we certainly learned all about the physics engine. A bit quirky at times, but it really adds that level of realism with things falling over. You just take a freeze frame, walls destroyed, perfect. And of course we learned how to break objects into smaller pieces. When a wall falls over, of course, and we use that example in the section, when a wall falls over, it doesn't just fall over brick by brick, it will fall over and break up into small pieces. So we made sure we've covered that as well. Lots of fun, lots of destruction, it was good.
Awesome. So thank you for being with us and dive into the next section.